Chapter 35 of 30 Years Since by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 35. As rapidly as post-horses and postilions would permit, Beecham's courier returned from London, bringing with him the officers who had been in Paris already on the same business, both of whom paid the young gentleman a great many compliments on his skill and proficiency in their particular branch of science. But as Beecham would very well have dispensed with such a flattering testimony of his abilities in thief-catching, we shall not give the somewhat circumlocutory praises of the officers at length. By this time the operation of extracting the ball had been performed upon the young sailor, and although there appeared no chance of his being able to bear a long journey for some time, yet he was already so far convalescent that no doubt was entertained of his ultimate recovery. Harding, Smithson, and the woman, Sarah Ings, confined apart, had already shown the indifference of the characters in the different manner in which they had borne their situation. The woman wept continually, declaring with loud lamentations that she would tell all she knew, if they would but spare her life. Smithson alternately stormed and raved, or gave way to brutal jests and wild merriment. Harding remained calm, cool, and silent, quite disposed to philosophize upon his situation with anyone who would philosophize with him, or to sneer at anyone who offered him one word of compassion or admonition, but at the same time a great deal too wary to utter a syllable that might endanger the slight hope of escape which still remained. After a brief interview with Beecham, the officers, with very natural impatience, hastened to visit their prisoners, and R., who held the principal post, immediately addressed Harding with a great deal of civility. "Oh, Mr. Harding," he said, "I am sorry to see you here." "You mistake, sir," said Harding. "I do not remember you at all." "What, not when you were secretary to Mr. Blank, the banker who failed?" said the officer. "Pooh, pooh, that cock won't stand, Master Harding. Don't you remember going up with me to Mr. Timms's at Clement's Inn, and how, after a great piece of work, he promised not only to drop proceedings against you, but to get you a good place into the bargain, if you would tell all about the embezzlement of the money? And a good place he did get you, I find. Pity you didn't keep it when you had got it. Howsoever, that is no business of mine. But you must take part of a shay with me over to England, Master Harding, and I dare say we shall be very good friends on the road." "Perhaps so," replied the prisoner, and, after a few more words, the officer proceeded to visit the other male culprit. To him, however, their manner was totally different. "Ha, Tony, my lad," cried the head officer, "how do you do this many a day? Why, how the devil were you such a soft chap as to get taken in for such a bad job as this? But you had nearly bilked us all, by jingo." "Oh, he replied. "Oh, it is a bad job indeed, but I knew well enough that I was well nigh up to my weight, and that d fellow Harding persuaded me, you see. But I say, tell me, is that young Harrison like to die? Harding gave me a h of a shot, and d him if I would die, if I would not take to talking and plead the king's pardon, do you see?" "No, no," answered the officer, "no chance of his dying. No, Tony, it's all up with you. They must hang two of you, and if anyone gets off, of course it will be the woman." At this hopeless picture of his situation, the ruffian first swore and blasphemed for 2 or 3 minutes, and then, relapsing into the other extreme, cast himself down and wept like a child. Fie, Tony," cried the officer. "Die game, anyhow. Why, I thought you were more varmint than that comes to. A man must die somehow, you know, and you have had a long pull at it, my lad. Besides, it's all nonsense when one knows that it must be so." "Aye, that's the job," said the prisoner, "if one could but think of some way of getting off." "Don't you fancy that?" replied the officer. "Why, look ye now, Tony, if you could get off for this last job, I'll tell you as a friend, they'd hang you for that burning business, for they've got proof enough against you for that." This last argument seemed completely to dispel all Mr. Anthony Smithson's objections to being hanged, and after 2 or 3 exhortations to those virtues that Bow Street officers expect from thieves, the two children of Mercury went on to visit the female prisoner. As, however, we have fully as great a disgust to scenes of low vice and misery as our readers can have, and only introduce them where compelled to do so in accordance with truth, we shall leave the officers to conduct their prisoners to England, and proceed to notice the events which occurred to Henry Beauchamp. That gentleman then set off from Paris with all speed, as soon as he had seen the prisoners safely consigned to the Bow Street officers. He well knew that such adventures as those in which he had lately been engaged could not fail to find their way into the mouth of rumour, and for many reasons he wished to reach London ere that lady was ready to go a-trumpeting before him, like the man with the box on his back who walks before Punch. He succeeded tolerably well, so that the fact of Henry Beauchamp being alive instead of dead, upon dry land instead of under the sea, was not known to above 50,000 people when he arrived in London. Out of this number about 1,000 had congratulated Lord Ashborough on the resuscitation of his nephew, but the noble lord had so impressed upon his mind that his nephew was dead, that he would not believe a word of the story, gravely saying that he would give it implicit credence as soon as he heard it from any one who would say that they had seen Henry Beauchamp with their own eyes. As none of those could be met with, and as the story could be traced to no authentic source, Lord Ashborough held fast his conviction, and up to the hour of Beauchamp's arrival continued in the same belief. It was late at night, or rather early in the morning, when Beauchamp did once more reach the capital, and as he imagined that he was not likely to find anything prepared for his accommodation in the house of a dead man, he directed the postboys to drive to a hotel rather than his own dwelling. It was later the next morning when he rose than he had purposed overnight, but nevertheless as soon as he was up he set forth for Lord Ashborough's, and walked immediately into the drawing-room, where, although the Earl himself had breakfasted and gone out, Beauchamp had soon the pleasure of holding his sister in his arms. Although Maria Beauchamp was not in the least surprised to see him, as she had long before received convincing assurances of his safety, and though she was as light a hearted girl as ever danced through life, unconscious of its sorrows, yet when she first met her brother after all the dangers he had encountered, the tears rose up in her eyes from the more vivid impression which his presence produced upon her mind of the loss she would have suffered had the report of his death been true. The conversation between Henry and Maria Beauchamp was long, and to them highly interesting, and had the world ever been known to forgive those who write dialogues between brothers and sisters, it should have been here transcribed for general edification. In the course of it, Maria made herself acquainted with a great many of the secrets of her brother's heart, and in return gave him a far more clear and minute insight into all the views and designs of Lord Ashborough and his worthy agent, Mr. Peter Timms, than Beauchamp had imagined so gay and careless a girl could have been shrewd enough to obtain. From her quick-sightedness in all those particulars, however, in which the interests of William Delaware were concerned, Beauchamp concluded, a result which his sister certainly neither wished nor anticipated, that the surmise of his good lawyer, Mr. Wilkinson, was not so far wrong as he had at first imagined, and he paused, musing with a smile over all the events that yet might be in the wheel of fortune. The anatomy of a smile is somewhat a curious thing, and that which played upon Beauchamp's lip was not without its several parts and divisions. In the first place, the idea of his gay, smart, and dashing sister falling in love with a frank, straightforward, simple-hearted sailor, who had neither rank nor fortune to offer her, made him smile. In the next place, he felt the slightest possible shade of disappointment at the idea of Maria Beauchamp not marrying the Marquis of this or the Earl of that, and the very absurdity of such a feeling in his bosom, of all the bosoms in the world, made him smile at himself, and the two smiles blended together. The third part of the smile, and which was the purest part too, proceeded from many a sweet feeling and bland hope which rose up when he suffered his mind's eye to gaze on into futurity, and thought of the varied sorts of happiness it might be in the power of him and his to bestow on a noble and generous race, weighed down by long misfortunes. As soon as all these feelings had had their moment and were gone, and he had given his sister an account of his wondrous accidents by flood and field. Beauchamp wrote a brief note to his uncle, informing him of his return, and then, nil actum reputans sequid superesset agendum, he set forth with all speed to his lawyer's chambers, in order to carry on the whole proceedings in exculpation of William Delaware as rapidly as possible. In regard to his conversation with Mr. Wilkinson, it may be only necessary to notice that Beauchamp found that, with prompt and judicious zeal, that gentleman, on discovering that some thoughts were already entertained at the Admiralty of inflicting a signal disgrace upon Captain Delaware for his evasion, had waited personally on the First Lord, and had laid before him that part of his client's deposition which admitted, in the clearest manner, that the money had been placed by Beauchamp himself in the young officer's room, thus showing that the chief circumstance of suspicion was taken from the evidence. He farther informed him that Beauchamp had discovered the real murderers, and was at that moment in pursuit of them, and he ended by beseeching him to pause ere he took any step in the proceedings which rumour declared to be in agitation. He was met in every respect with frank and gentlemanly courtesy, and was assured that nothing could be more gratifying to his Majesty than to find just cause for suspending that expression of his indignation against any officer in his service which the stern voice of justice could alone compel him to punish. So far everything was satisfactory. "And now," said Beauchamp, "all that remains to be done for the present is to open the eyes of my uncle to the conduct of this base attorney of his." Spare us, Mr. Beauchamp, I beg," said Mr. Wilkinson, "but without attempting to defend attorneys, who, as a body, have got a bad name, not so much, I believe, from having more rogues among them than are to be found in other professions, but from having greater opportunities of roguery. Allow me to say that I am afraid you will find it a difficult thing to open your uncle's eyes." Why, my dear sir?" demanded Beauchamp. "We can prove the facts. Tell me why." "Oh, for many reasons," answered Mr. Wilkinson, musing, and perhaps not exactly liking to state the real basis of his opinion. "The fact is, it is like eating garlic, Mr. Beauchamp, or drinking spirits, or taking any other of those things which a man nauseates at first, but gets very fond of by degrees. When a person grows fond of a rogue, he gradually gets to like him beyond any one else, and soon finds he cannot do without him." Beauchamp smiled, though there was a slight sort of mistiness about the conclusion of Mr. Wilkinson's illustration, which he did not exactly like. However, he pressed him no farther, and having learned that Lord Ashborough was carrying on a suit against Sir Sidney Delaware in regard to the annuity, with somewhat sharper measures than the generality of the profession considered reputable, he obtained the bill for £10,000 which Mr. Timms had presented in lieu of the money due from the Earl, and then returned to his uncle's dwelling. Lord Ashborough was now at home, and although Miss Beauchamp had broke the news of her brother's return, and added a number of reasons and apologies for his not having sooner communicated the fact of his safety, the Earl was still both agitated and offended, and his reception of Beauchamp showed a strange mixture of pride and irritation and pleasure. "And pray, Henry, may I ask," he said, after the first salutations were over, "may ask, I say, for your movements, and their causes may both require the same diplomatic secrecy which you have of late so skilfully displayed. May I ask, I say, why you were pleased to conceal your existence from your nearest relations? Your sister has indeed already favoured me with so many reasons that I confess I have become puzzled and bewildered by the number, and will fain hear your own motives from your own lips." Beauchamp was not a man to make any excuse to anyone, if he had not a true one ready at his hand. In the present instance, he thought it best to tell Lord Ashborough the simple truth, and then leave him to receive it as an excuse or not, as he might think best, taking care at the same time to word it with all due respect and kindness, in deference to the affection which he knew his uncle felt toward him. "The fact is, my dear sir," he answered, "for the first fortnight or 3 weeks after you had fancied me drowned, I was not at all aware of such a report. I was first detained at a cottage with a dislocated ankle, and next ill of a fever at Hertford Bridge, and at the time I learned the rumour of my own death, I was under the absolute necessity of going to Paris in order to pursue the miscreants who committed the horrid murder, of which you have heard, at Ribery. As I was the only person who could prove the facts against them, or lead to their apprehension, the rumour of my death I knew would throw them off their guard, and therefore it was necessary to leave it uncontradicted. Besides—" "But surely," interrupted Lord Ashborough, who, though strongly inclined to inquire farther concerning the murderers, was resolved to press Beauchamp home in the first instance, "but surely you could have trusted to my discretion in the business." "Undoubtedly, my lord," replied Beauchamp, "and I need not tell you that, under ordinary circumstances, you would have been the very first person to whom I should have communicated my situation, and whom I should have consulted in what I was undertaking." Lord Ashborough bowed his head with a placable smile, and Beauchamp continued, "But I could have only done so by writing to you, or by coming to see you. The latter, of course, was out of the question, for I was not willing to trust my secret to your host of servants, and to write was equally impossible, and there were circumstances to explain, which could only be done personally." "How so? Why so?" demanded the Earl. "That is what I was about to explain," answered Beauchamp. "The fact is that the man of all others whose greatest interest it was to foil me in endeavouring to bring the murderers to justice, with the exception, of course, of the murderers themselves, is your confidential man of business and lawyer, Mr. Peter Timms." Lord Ashborough started, for though this carried him back to the subject of the murderers, it was not exactly in the way he liked best. "You are mistaken, Henry," he said, "quite mistaken. No man has been more anxious in thought, or more strenuous in exertion, than Mr. Timms, to bring the murderers of his uncle to justice. You forget their near relationship, and he is a great deal to—" Lord Ashborough would fain have added "too honest a man," but the words stuck in his throat, and as he paused, Beauchamp finished the sentence for him. "Too great a rogue, my lord, he most certainly is, ever to think of relationship where interest is concerned. I found that out some time ago, ere I took a step of removing my affairs from his hands to those of Messrs. Steelyard and Wilkinson." Lord Ashborough drew himself up. "I believe, sir," he said, "that I have not acquired the character in the world of a man who is likely to employ a rogue, either from folly or knavery. But as you have brought a serious accusation against my ordinary man of business, I shall of course expect you to substantiate it fully." "That I will do completely to your lordship's satisfaction," replied Beauchamp; "and, indeed, I trust you will believe me, my dear uncle, when I assure you that the certainty of this man having, by a gross misrepresentation of facts, involved you in circumstances which will be very painful to you when you learn all the details, is the great inducement which makes me accuse your agent at once to yourself, before I take such measures as must expose him to the world." Beauchamp paused, but his intimate acquaintance with his uncle's character had given him a sort of intuitive insight into what was passing in his mind, and had revealed a great many secrets, which, as his nephew, he would rather not have learned, but which of course he acted upon in his transactions with the noble Earl. In the present instance he clearly perceived that Lord Ashborough's vanity was getting irritable at the very idea of having been cheated, and that, at the same time, curiosity and anxiety were both striving hard to keep vanity down till they were satisfied, and that vanity being the strongest was likely to have her own way. Under these circumstances, Beauchamp thought it would be best to throw in a little soothing matter to quiet the more restive animal of the three, and keep her from kicking. He therefore added, in a very brief pause, "I know, my lord, that the plans of this man, which could deceive even your sagacity, must have been very deeply and artfully laid, and unless," he added, anxious not to assume superior wisdom, "and unless accident and his own imprudence had thrown into my hands the means of establishing his knavery beyond a doubt, I should not have ventured to make such a charge as I have brought against him. I know, however, that you are too candid not to yield to conviction. and my purpose is to request that you would call him to your presence and suffer me to ask him a question or two before you." "Of course, Henry," replied the Earl. "I am not only willing, but anxious in the highest degree, to give up my mind entirely to truth, for besides the great personal interest which I have in the honesty of a man to whom I confide so much as to this Mr. Timms, the abstract love of severe and impartial justice also requires that I should hear any evidence that can be brought in support of so grave a charge, so boldly made. But tell me," he continued, feeling that there were particular points on which he would not particularly like to have his agent questioned in his presence, "tell me, do the questions you intend to put refer to any affairs of mine, or to affairs of your own? For I know you have several times employed this Mr. Timms. If to mine, I must say nay most decidedly, for I can permit no one either to investigate or interfere with business which I am competent to manage myself." "My questions will refer entirely to business of my own, my lord," replied Beauchamp. "With yours I should never presume to meddle, though I feel perfectly convinced that you would not have proceeded at law against Sir Sidney Delaware for a sum that had been already paid to your agent, had you not been persuaded by an infamous villain that the money received did not constitute a legal payment, inasmuch as he affirmed that it was the fruits of robbery." Lord Ashborough turned a little pale, but he had canvassed the matter so often with Mr. Timms, and considered all the contingencies so accurately, that he was prepared at every point for defence. "Nay, Henry, nay," he said, assuming a benignant smile. "Nay, I see which way your prejudices lead you. The most connected evidence would not convince either yourself or your sister of that unhappy young man's guilt. But even taking the converse of the matter, and supposing that he has been accused erroneously, still you do great injustice to the poor little lawyer, who surely commits no great crime in believing a man to be guilty, against whom a coroner's jury, after calm investigation and mature deliberation, have given a verdict of wilful murder." "In the first place, my lord," replied Beauchamp coolly, "in regard to William Delaware, as I know your lordship would be as much delighted to see his innocence clearly established as anyone—" "Oh, certainly, certainly," interrupted the Earl, with all the energy that a man adds to a falsehood in order to make it weigh as much as truth. "Certainly, let justice be done, and let the innocent be cleared." "Well, then," added Beauchamp, with the slightest possible touch of causticity in his manner, "you will be delighted to hear that there remains not the slightest doubt of William Delaware's innocence. In the first place, I myself was encountered by the murderers at the very door of the dead man's house, was carried off by them after being knocked down and stunned, which facts I can distinctly prove against at least 2 of them. In the next place, I have the confession of one in my writing desk, and in the third place, 3 of them are by this time at Dover, on their way to trial. The 4th is in Paris, but in safe hands too, and will come over to give his testimony as king's evidence." Lord Ashborough again turned pale, and while he declared that he trusted most sincerely it would be proved as his nephew anticipated, he rang the bell, and in an undertone bade the servant bring him some of the drops to which we have before seen him apply. Beauchamp's next sentences, however, were in some degree a relief, for they afforded a fair hope of being able to cast all the blame upon Mr. Timms, should it be rendered necessary by any after disclosures. "So much for that matter, my lord," added his nephew, "and of course I cannot blame Mr. Timms for not divining all the evidence that might ultimately be collected to exculpate Captain Delaware. But what I intend to establish is, that at the very time that he, Mr. Timms, was retaining, under the pretence that the money was a part of his uncle's property, a sum which of right belonged to you, having been paid in redemption of the Emberton annuity, that at the very time he was urging you on to proceed severely against a family which he taught you to believe was criminal, that while he was doing all this he was perfectly well aware that the money did not belong to his uncle, that it had never been the fruits of robbery, and that I must have placed it in the chamber of Captain Delaware, as that gentleman himself asserted." "If you can prove that, Henry," replied his uncle, "I will admit that I have been most grossly deceived, and will abandon the fellow for ever. but I should like to hear what evidence you can bring forward in corroboration of these assertions." "You shall hear, my lord, to-morrow, if you will order him to be here after breakfast," replied Beauchamp. "You must confront the accuser and the accused before you judge, and in the meantime, as I intend to dine with you, I will go and dress, for it is growing late." End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of 30 Years Since by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 36. The Earl of Ashborough was a good deal disturbed, as the reader who remembers all the transactions which had before occurred may easily imagine. His nephew's return had certainly been a very joyful event, but it was not unaccompanied by many drawbacks. Thus there was the probable overthrow of all his schemes against the Delawares, a considerable loss of money, which was painful to the noble Earl just in proportion as his fortune was immense, and last, not least, there was a strong chance, of certain unpleasant imputations lighting on his character, and of certain disclosures being made in regard to his plans, which he would rather have died to avoid than lived to see. The hatred which had rooted itself so deeply in his heart against Sir Sidney Delaware had lost none of its freshness. The spirit of revenge, kindled long ago and fed with 1,000 slight circumstances through a long lapse of years, had lost none of its intensity, but still, for the time, the fear of shame and dishonour was paramount, and the Earl cursed the day in which he had been tempted to risk one rash step in pursuit of vengeance. He determined, however, to lay the whole blame upon Mr. Timms, and if Beauchamp could prove the lawyer had reason to know that Captain Delaware was innocent, to affect vast indignation at his conduct, and to cast him off with all those signs of abhorrence and contempt which would exculpate himself in the eyes of the world for any participation in his evil designs. Of the pecuniary loss, too, which he was likely to suffer by the whole affair, he resolved to make the most, as a proof that he had been himself deceived and plundered, and by exclaiming loudly against the perfidy of his agent, to cast a dark shade of suspicion upon every assertion that Mr. Timms might make, as springing from the mere malice of a discharged agent. There was one subject of self-gratulation in Lord Ashborough's breast, which was doubly sweet, as it flattered his ideas of his own wisdom, and afforded the best point in his situation with regard to Mr. Timms. This was the fact of never having committed himself on paper in regard to the family of Sir Sidney Delaware, or his purposes of revenge against them, and he resolved to make the most of that also. After long consideration of all these particulars, he believed that he could luckily act toward his lawyer exactly as if he himself had been perfectly pure and spotless in the whole transaction. He accordingly sent off a note to Mr. Timms, requesting his presence at 11 o'clock on the following day, having determined that, in the first instance, he would give the attorney every sort of gentlemanly support in his encounter with Beauchamp, but that, if he found Beauchamp's charge could be made good against the lawyer, he would instantly throw him off, dismiss him from his employment, and treat him with proud and indignant contempt. All these thoughts occupied him some time, and it was late before he entered the drawing-room, where his nephew and niece were already waiting. But the space thus employed had fully restored his equanimity, and the dinner passed over with a degree of cheerfulness and ease on his part, which Beauchamp had almost doubted that his uncle would be able to maintain. The evening was equally tranquil. His wandering nephew's adventures seemed to afford Lord Ashborough fully as much matter of interest and amusement as it did to Miss Beauchamp, and their party broke up late after a pleasant and tranquil night. The next morning the Earl perhaps felt a little nervous, but he had that most blessed quality, which was very probably the subject of the Scotch pedlar's aspirations, when he added to his prayers, "God send us a good conceit of ourselves," and being very far from ever thinking that he could by any chance have acted grossly amiss, he soon recovered from his more serious apprehensions of the world's censure, though he admitted that occasionally mankind did put a misconstruction on the most virtuous conduct. But he trusted that his own character was too well established to permit of such a result. With this proud consciousness, we cannot say of virtue, but at least of an established reputation, which often does quite as well, the Earl proceeded after breakfast to his library, accompanied by his nephew, and ringing the bell, desired to know whether Mr. Timms had arrived. The servant replied in the negative, and, after having ordered the lawyer to be admitted when he did appear, he turned to Beauchamp, observing that the fellow had grown somewhat negligent of late, since he had succeeded to his uncle's fortune. The Earl had scarcely concluded this sentence when Mr. Timms himself appeared at the door, bowing low, with habitual reverence for Turkey carpets and ormolu, even before he was completely in the room. On seeing Beauchamp, which he did the very next moment, as that gentleman had placed himself at the bay window, and turned round on hearing the door open, Mr. Timms had nearly fallen prostrate on the floor, and pale did he become, with the exception of the red climax to his nose, which remained of its own ruby hue, while all around grew white. His impudence, however, which was a very phoenix, and was ever renewed from its own ashes, came instantly to his aid, and advancing with a smile of simpering joy, he exclaimed, "Goodness, Mr. Beauchamp, I am surprised, sir, and delighted to see you. We all thought you were drowned." "To your surprise, Mr. Timms," replied Beauchamp, "I have no doubt. To your delight, I am not quite so sure. And as to my being drowned, I know everyone believed it, and no one more thoroughly than yourself, Mr. Timms." "I beg pardon, sir, I beg pardon, but you seem offended," said Mr. Timms, assuming the aspect of injured innocence. "I meant no offence, sir. My lord, have I said anything offensive?" "No, Mr. Timms, no," replied Lord Ashborough. "Be so good as to take a seat, sir. I am inclined to believe that my nephew misconceived you, but he will explain himself, for it is on his business I sent for you." "Oh, is that the case?" exclaimed the lawyer, who began to feel somewhat perplexed at his situation. "If your lordship had let me know that such was your purpose, I might have come prepared." "I acted, Mr. Timms, as I thought best," answered the peer coldly, "and I confess I do not see what need you could have for preparation." "Why, I do think, sir, of all things considered," replied the lawyer, "I do think your lordship might have given me intimation, as the business in which I am engaged on your lordship's account—" "Has nothing on earth to do with my nephew, nor my nephew with it, Mr. Timms," replied Lord Ashborough sternly. "We will keep to the point, sir, if you please. Henry, you said you had some questions to ask this person. You had better ask them." "Person?" muttered Mr. Timms, fidgeting on his chair. "Person?" But he had soon more serious matter to think of, for Beauchamp, approaching the table, sat down at the side next to the window, and taking out his pocket-book, spoke in a calm, mild tone, which had grown infinitely more moderate than at first, as he saw the terrible agitation under which the unhappy man laboured. "Now, Mr. Timms," he said, "I neither want to puzzle you nor to annoy you by what I am going to ask, but there are certain matters on which you must give a full explanation, both for my satisfaction and my uncle's." "No, no, Henry, pardon me," interrupted the Earl. "The business is yours alone. I am perfectly satisfied for my part. I have heard a charge, but no proof, and consequently I should be doing injustice to Mr. Timms were I to be dissatisfied." "My lord, the business is certainly mine," replied Beauchamp, "but it is also yours to the extent of at least £10,000, if not more. But to the point. My first question is, Mr. Timms, how you came to detain, upon the pretence that it had been stolen from your uncle, the sum of £25,000 paid by Sir Sidney Delaware to you as Lord Ashborough's agent, when at the time you detained it upon that pretext, you perfectly well knew that it had not been stolen, and that it had been put in Captain Delaware's room by me." "But I never knew any such thing, sir," replied Mr. Timms. "I believed, as everybody else believed, that Captain Delaware, when he murdered my poor unhappy uncle, had stolen those notes. And permit me to say, sir," he added, assuming a slight touch of bluster, Permit me to say, I have better cause to believe such to be the case than you have to accuse me of actions I should despise, sir. What reason had I to suppose you placed the money there?" "Nay, nay, Mr. Timms," said Beauchamp calmly, "do not lose your temper. Remember, sir, passion may throw you off your guard, and you will yet have occasion for all your wit in your exculpation. You ask what reason you had to suppose I placed the money in Captain Delaware's room. I will tell you, Mr. Timms. First, because among your uncle's papers you found an acquittance in my handwriting for the sum of £15,000, received by him on my account from Messrs. Steelyard and Wilkinson." But, sir," cried Mr. Timms. "Do not interrupt me, sir," said Beauchamp. "Next, I say, because you found a note of hand, signed by me for the sum of £10,000, advanced to me by your uncle, and dated on the very day on which he was murdered, poor man." "But listen to me, Henry," said Lord Ashborough. "All this does not show that Mr. Timms knew that these several sums had been appropriated by you in the somewhat quixotical manner that, as it proves, they were employed." "It is at least a strong presumption that he might have known it if he had liked," replied Beauchamp, adding with a smile, "especially when he knew me to be of a quixotical disposition, and when William Delaware himself pointed me out as the only person likely to have placed them there. But you must remember also that the sum was precisely the same, and that, knowing I had received it—" "I must once more interrupt you, Mr. Beauchamp," said the lawyer with a dignified air. "But you are and have been assuming as facts what are not facts. I did not know that you had received that sum. I found no document, at least I have as yet found no document, among my late uncle's papers, which refers to the sum of £15,000 received on your account, and handed over to you in due course. And therefore, sir, the basis of your argument is erroneous, although, as my noble patron declares, with his usual candour and perspicuity, even were it all true, had I discovered the papers of which you speak, that my uncle had paid you the precise sum, still I had no proof that there was any connection between that fact and the payment made to me at Emberton Park." "There was a strong presumption, at least, Mr. Timms," replied Beauchamp, who had listened with the utmost calmness, "and I certainly cannot prove that you have found the document referring to the £15,000 as yet. Allow me to compliment you on the introduction of those two words. I certainly cannot prove that you have found my acquaintance to your uncle." "Well then, Henry," said the Earl, with a benign smile to Mr. Timms, "I think your evidence halts." "Your pardon, my lord," replied Beauchamp. "I am only deposing of one part of the subject first. You may not have found it, Mr. Timms, as yet, but let me tell you, sir, that you must find it, or account to my solicitors for £15,000 received by your late uncle on my account." Mr. Timms turned very red, for he saw that he was nearer to the horns of that ugly beast, a dilemma, than he had imagined. Still, however, he thought that he had triumphantly opposed Beauchamp's charge, and therefore he replied with a very tolerable degree of coolness, "I will search for the papers, sir, and of course act according to the best of my judgment afterward." "And in the meantime, Mr. Timms," continued Beauchamp, "we will speak of the £10,000 which I received from your uncle. I think you acknowledge, or at least tacitly admit, that you found my note of hand for that amount among your uncle's papers. Indeed, it was only extraordinary that you should overlook the acquittance, which was pinned to the note, and which you must have separated from it before you got it stamped, and presented it to my solicitors, in payment of the sum of £10,000 due to me by Lord Ashborough as the balance of our guardianship account." Mr. Timms' face grew red, and white, and yellow, and blue by turns. Never there was such a prismatic complexion as Beauchamp's last speech produced. Lord Ashborough watched them all, and then demanded, "Did you presume, sir, to stop money which I commissioned you to pay, in the way to which Mr. Beauchamp alludes?" Mr. Timms was au bois, and consequently he turned upon the weakest of his pursuers. "I did indeed, my lord," he said in a significant tone. I did it for the best, both in accordance with your lordship's views and interests, and my own poor judgment, and I am perfectly ready to explain my motives either to your lordship alone, or in the presence of your nephew." Lord Ashborough changed colour also, and bowing his head haughtily, he said, "That is unnecessary, Mr. Timms. We will speak of all that concerns myself hereafter." "Oh, just as your lordship pleases," said the lawyer. "I have nothing to conceal." "I am glad to hear it," said Beauchamp, willing to spare his uncle any unpleasant discussion. "I am glad to hear it, sir, for now we come to the most inexplicable part of the whole transaction. I say inexplicable because it is quite so to me. How a man of your sagacity could commit such an oversight as, at the very time he was accusing an innocent person of murder, at the very time he was retaining in his hands £25,000 unjustly, on the plea that they had been stolen, at the very time he was carrying on 2 ruinous suits at law against an honourable man for money which had already been paid, I say that it is inexplicable to me how at the very time he was doing all this he should commit such an oversight as to present to my solicitors this note of hand, on the back of which is written in my own writing the numbers and dates of all the notes I received from his uncle, and which are the numbers and dates of the very notes that he was at that time attempting to show were stolen. Look at it, my lord, and read numbers and dates of notes received from Mr. Timms of Ribery, and conceive how avarice must have taken hold of a man ere he could commit such an egregious blunder. Why, Mr. Timms, could you not wait a few days, a week, a fortnight, even a month, to make sure that the fishes had me safe, before you presented this note? By heaven, I should have thought such a thing impossible, had I not often, or rather always, seen that by what would seem a law of Providence, the most egregious rogues are always sure to leave some door open to detection." Mr. Timms had remained as one struck dumb. Not that he had overlooked the fact which Beauchamp now brought forward, for he had remarked it from the first, and knew that it might speak strongly against him, but the desire of retaining the £10,000 had blinded his eyes to one half the consequences, and diminished his estimation of the other, had made him confidently believe that Beauchamp was really drowned, and that if he were not, he would never remember the memorandum he had made on the night which gave birth to so many events. The folly of his conduct, however, now appeared to him in the most forcible manner, and for the moment completely overpowered him. Quirks, quibbles, evasions, impudence itself, all deserted him, till by the most fortunate chance in the world Beauchamp pronounced the word rogue, which instantly called anger to his aid. "Rogue, sir, rogue!" he exclaimed, starting up, while the whiteness of consternation was succeeded in his countenance by the rubicundity of wrath. "Rogue, sir! The word is actionable. Did you call me a rogue?" It was too much for human patience. "Yes, sir," replied Beauchamp, "I did, and I do. I call you a rogue because I have proved you one. I look upon you as a contemptible blackguard, as I have long done, and if you stare in my face with that air one moment more, I will kick you from that door into Grosvenor Square, and the passage is a long one." Mr. Timms instantly dropped his eyes to the ground, and Lord Ashborough interfered. "You are too warm, Henry," he said, seeing evidently that Mr. Timms must be given up, said therefore that he might as well assume the character of the dignified, unimpassioned judge. "You are too warm, but you have made out your charge most completely. Mr. Timms, you are no longer my solicitor. You must have known, sir, that this Captain Delaware, whatever faults he may have, and whatever crimes he may have committed, had not obtained the notes in question by robbing your uncle. You must have known it, sir. You could not help knowing it, and I conceive that you have deceived me into taking a great many steps which might bring my character into disrepute, if it were not, thank God, pretty well established. I say, I conceive your having done so to be more base and criminal than even the sort of frauds you have committed in regard to the different sums of money, which, depend upon it, shall be strictly investigated." Loud insolence not having proved at all successful, Mr. Timms now resorted to dogged impudence. "Your lordship may find cause, upon a little reflection," he said, moving gradually toward the door, "to make your measures towards me somewhat more lenient than you propose. I should be sorry to injure your lordship's well-established character, but of course if I am attacked I must defend myself, and I will take care that my defence shall be public enough. There are 2 or 3 little transactions which your lordship will think over, and determine upon having laid open, or not, as you please." "Do you hear the fellow's insolence?" demanded the Earl, turning with a half-smile towards his nephew. "Mr. Timms," he added, "you are scarcely worthy of contempt. I fear no true statement of anything I have done, and I shall take care, if you make any false one, that you shall be severely punished. You have deceived me, sir, grossly. You have represented people to call me as criminal, who were really innocent, and you have laboured to stir up my indignation against them for your own base purposes. Do not answer me, sir, but quit the room and the house, and I shall take care that your account be called for, and examined by one who will look into them thoroughly." Thus saying, the Earl, with a proud and dignified wave of the hand, pointed to the door. Mr. Timms would fain have added a few words more, but Lord Ashborough waved him forth again, and there was also a cloud lowering upon Henry Beauchamp's brow, which boded no very pleasant results from farther insolence, so that, upon second thoughts, Mr. Timms judged it best to make his exit tranquilly. This he was suffered to do, and the door closed upon him for ever. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of 30 Years Since by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 37. We must now, for a time, leave Henry Beauchamp and the Earl of Ashborough, and turn to the small, neat country town of , in the gaol of which place Harding, Smithson, and Sarah Ings were at length safely lodged, within a few days after Beauchamp's return to his native country. Walter Harrison, skilfully treated and carefully attended, was soon able to undertake the journey to England, and as the fixed determination he had shown to further the ends of justice at all risks left no doubt of his sincerity, he was permitted to act without restraint, and proceeded steadily toward his destination, indeed more rapidly than his feeble state properly admitted. Presenting himself uncalled before the magistrates of the town, he informed them at once of his name, required them to receive his voluntary confession, and in consequence to commit him to prison. The first part of his demand was of course acceded to, but it was intimated to him that, in consequence of his firm and determined conduct throughout at least the latter part of the dark business in which he had unfortunately been engaged, he would not be deprived of his liberty. To the surprise of the magistrates, however, he replied that he knew nothing of their forms and manner of proceeding in these matters, but that he had made up his mind to the line of conduct he was to pursue. On no consideration whatever, he said, would he be king's evidence, a term for which he seemed to entertain the most extraordinary aversion. His confession, he said, was clear and ample, made without any promises of pardon or favour, demanded or given. He would therefore go to prison like the others, and be brought to trial like them. But as he was guilty, he would plead guilty in regard to the robbery, though not in regard to the murder. This, he said, was his firm determination, though he would be found ready at any time to give every sort of information that might be required to make out the case against his accomplices and himself. As the gaol delivery was to be held in a few days, the penance of imprisonment which he thus imposed upon himself was not great, but even the short period of confinement to which he thus voluntarily subjected himself seemed greatly to affect his health and spirits. In vain the governor of the prison, under the idea that apprehensions in regard to his ultimate fate were preying upon his mind, assured him that the king's pardon, promised by proclamation to any but the actual murderers, secured him from all danger. He replied that he feared nothing but his own thoughts, for that, since he had come back to the country, and the county in which the terrible crime wherein he had participated had been perpetrated, a heavy cloud had seemed to come over him, which he could not shake off. His bold, daring, and impetuous manner was now all gone, and in its place there appeared a deep, silent sternness, somewhat impatient of contradiction, but determined rather than violent. The great loss of blood he had sustained had rendered him as pale as ashes, and anxiety and suffering had bowed his powerful frame, and left him merely the shadow of what he formerly was. Some apprehensions indeed appeared to be entertained by those who watched, lest he should become so ill as to be unable to undergo the business of the trial, but in this they were deceived, and his strength, on the contrary, appeared greater, and his energies more alive, on the day before that appointed for the assizes. At length the day arrived, and all the usual formalities having taken place, the heavy list of crimes was adverted to and lamented by the judge. The grand jury was exhorted and sworn, and proceeded to its functions. As everyone expected, the first bill brought before them, which was that against Captain William Delaware for the murder of Mr. Timms at Ribery, was at once thrown out. Not so, however, that against Harding and his accomplices, which being found a true bill, was immediately proceeded on. All our readers are most probably acquainted with the solemn array of a court of justice, though an interesting, always a painful scene. On the present occasion, of course, from the blackness of the crime committed, and the many extraordinary circumstances that accompanied and followed it, the excitement produced was great, and the court crowded in every part. The preliminaries having been gone through, the 4 prisoners were put to the bar, and a good deal of confusion ensued, from the endeavour of the various spectators to obtain a full view of the accused, the class of women who frequent criminal courts struggling forward to see the culprits with more than masculine boldness. Harding, who was beyond doubt a handsome man, first advanced to the bar. He was dressed with scrupulous care, and with his neck wrapped in a thick black cravat, his double-breasted waistcoat buttoned up to his chin, and his dark frock-coat thrown back from his chest, he looked very much like the private secretary of a German prince. His cool and tranquil air and easy carriage might have been construed into the expression of conscious innocence, but for a slight, very slight, sneer that curled the corner of his lip, entirely different from the indignant expansion of the nostril with which innocence sometimes meets a false accusation. He gazed for a single instant round the court, and then withdrew his eyes, while all the reporters scribbled rapidly in their notebooks, preparing to make him a newspaper wonder, and hand him down to posterity as one of the heroes of the gallows. The next that came up was the well-known Tony Smithson, who, though he had confronted more than one court of justice on previous occasions, now, from the magnitude of the offence and the certainty that his conviction would follow, had lost all self-command, and approached the bar pale, trembling, and agitated. Next approached Sarah Ings, with the most persevering of all human passions, vanity, still uppermost. Dressed forth in all the gay and vulgar smartness of the Rue de Vivienne and the Palais Royal, with a touch or two of rouge upon her cheeks to hide the ravages of apprehension, she presented herself before the court that was to try her, and the judge who might have to doom her to death, with a simpering and coquettish smile, thinking fully as much of the impression of her charms and her finery upon the spectators as of her awful situation and its probable result. Last appeared Walter Harrison, with a bold, firm step, a bright red spot on each of his pale cheeks, and his eye sparkling from feverish excitement. He leaned his hand upon the bar, and after gazing rapidly and boldly round the court, fixed his eyes upon the clerk of the arraigns, as he proceeded to read the indictment. That document was conceived in the usual tenor, and comprised all the various acts which the prisoners could or might have committed in the perpetration of their crime, with all the legal terms and expressions necessary to prevent dubiety. Harding listened to every word with scrupulous attention, and it was observed that at several of the counts in the indictment, which described the act that he had committed with much greater precision than he had expected, he set his teeth hard. On the question being put to each of the prisoners, "How say you, guilty or not guilty?" the first three pleaded not guilty, and what is termed put themselves upon their country, or in fact appealed to a jury. Walter Harrison, however, in a bold, firm voice, replied at once, "Guilty of the robbery, but not guilty of the murder," and consequently it was found necessary to proceed on his trial also, upon several of the counts in the indictment. The trial then went on, and as the reader is already aware of the greater part of the evidence that could be brought forward, it shall be but briefly recapitulated here. The footprints on the floor of the room where the murder had been committed, and the mark of the hand on the wall, were proved to correspond exactly with the feet of Harding and Smithson, and with the hand of the latter. The marks in the passage were also proved to have been caused by the feet of the young sailor, and evidence was given that Harding had paid the master of a cutter, hired to carry them to France, with one of the notes which could be traced to the possession of the miser of Ribery a few days before his death. The ci devant smuggler, Billy Small, swore positively to the persons of Harding, Smithson, Harrison, and the woman, and detailed fully the particulars of their arrival at his house, with a gentleman whose ankle was dislocated, and who had evidently received a severe contusion on the forehead. The Bow Street officers proved the state of the prisoner's apartments in Paris, the considerable sums of money there found, and a variety of minor facts which all aggravated the suspicions against them. And as the principal witness, Henry Beauchamp was at length called, in order to establish the fact of the prisoner's having been, on the very night of the murder, at the house of Mr. Timms, and having thence proceeded direct to the cottage of the smuggler. As he entered the witness box, the cheek of Harding turned a shade paler, but at the same time his eye flashed with an expression rather of rage than fear. As his former master went on, however, he recovered his composure and listened calmly, while Beauchamp clearly and distinctly detailed all the events from his second visit to Mr. Timms's house on the night of the murder till he was delivered over to the care of the old smuggler and his family. Throughout the trial Harding had acted as his own counsel, and now he proceeded with an air of cool, determined effrontery to cross-examine his former master, mingling skilfully those questions which might tend to exculpate himself with those which he thought would annoy the witness. "Allow me to ask you, Mr. Beauchamp," he said, "whether while I was in your service you ever detected me in any act of dishonesty?" "To speak but candidly," replied Beauchamp, "I never did." "Did I not on more than one occasion," proceeded Harding, "when your tradesmen endeavoured to cheat or overcharge you, point out to you the fact?" "You certainly did," replied his former master. "So far, then, your evidence is favourable to me," continued the culprit. "Now pray tell me, Mr. Beauchamp, what was your own errand at the house of Mr. Timms on the night in question? Or rather, what became of you between the first and second calls which you made at his dwelling during that evening?" And he fixed his eye upon the witness's countenance with a degree of sneering triumph at the pain he imagined the question would cause him. But Beauchamp answered with the utmost coolness. "I do not know," he said, "that any law would oblige me to reply to a demand which does not seem to bear upon the case, but nevertheless I have not the slightest objection to do so. I had, on the first visit I paid to the unhappy man who was afterward murdered, received from him the sum of £25,000, which I had promised to advance on mortgage on the estate of my cousin, Sir Sidney Delaware. From the house of Mr. Timms I went straight to Emberton Park, and having discovered that Captain Delaware was absent from home, I took the liberty, as a relation and intimate friend, of entering his room and leaving the money enveloped in a packet upon his dressing table, purposing to give him intimation of the fact next morning." "Was that not rather a hazardous action, sir?" demanded Harding with cool insolence, "especially when there were so many thieves abroad?" "No more so, it would seem," replied Beauchamp, "than to carry it in my pocket from Ribery to Emberton, when you were in my neighbourhood. but luckily it happened that you neither knew the one fact nor the other." Harding was silent for a moment, finding that sarcasms were edged tools, which he had better not employ against Beauchamp, who had full strength to turn them back upon himself, with that sort of cold calmness which made them 1,000 times more stinging. The pause was so long that Beauchamp at length asked, "Have you any other questions to put to me?" "Yes, several," replied the prisoner, "several. Why did you not give the money into the hands of Sir Sidney Delaware himself when you found that his son was absent?" "Because it was not my pleasure to do so," replied Beauchamp. "I must submit to the court whether these questions are relevant." The judge at once supported the witness's objection, and the prisoner being told that he must absolutely confine himself to the matter before the court, proceeded, "Pray, Mr. Beauchamp, was the moon shining at the time of your return to Ribery?" "It was shining brightly," replied Beauchamp. "Then it was by the light of the moon that you recognised me among the persons coming out of the miser's house?" demanded the prisoner. "I did not say that I recognised you in the slightest degree," replied his former master, "till I found myself in the boat upon the water." "Then you positively did not recognise me at all at the miser's house?" said Harding, with a smile of triumph. "I did not," answered Beauchamp, "as I said before. All I saw on the opening of the door were the forms of 3 men and a woman standing in the passage. As the moon was not shining directly on that side of the house, I could not distinguish their features so perfectly as to swear to any one of them. But the foremost of the men was exactly of your height and appearance, and I have already sworn that I saw you in the boat after I recovered my recollection." "Pray what space of time do you think had elapsed," Harding next demanded, "between the time of your return to Ribery and your finding yourself in the boat?" Beauchamp replied that of course he could not exactly tell, but he imagined that it must have been more than an hour. "If such were the case," said the prisoner, "then the moon, which you said was shining on the western side of the miser's house when you reached the door, must have set before you recovered your senses, and I should like to know how, without any light on a dark night, and with your thoughts confused, as they must have been, after such a blow as you describe, you could recognise me as to swear to my identity, when by your own account you could not stand up in the boat even for a moment." "In the first place," answered Beauchamp, "the moon had not set, though she was setting, and her very position at the moment I did attempt to rise showed me your features more distinctly than if she had been higher in the sky, for she shone at that moment under your hat. I was confused, certainly, and in that confusion I had very nearly called you by your name, but luckily I recollected in time the attack made upon my own person, and the extraordinary circumstances in which I was placed, or probably the consequences might have been fatal to me also." "He should not have touched a hair on your head," said Walter Harrison aloud, and the eyes of the whole court were instantly turned upon him. But the young man paused and looked toward Harding, adding, "I do not want to interrupt him. Let him say his say, and then I will say mine." Harding had turned very pale, but he added eagerly, "One more question, sir, and I have done. Was this momentary and imperfect glance which you obtained of the countenance of one of the men in the boat with you all which led you to believe that I was that person?" "Although that glance would have been quite sufficient to satisfy me," replied Beauchamp, "what I had learned from that glance was confirmed by the sound of your voice, and by the fact of your having dropped this powder flask out of your pocket upon the beach, when embarking for France, which powder flask you must well remember my giving to you some days before, because it did not measure the right charge for my guns." "I never saw it before in my life," replied Harding solemnly, and then ceased his interrogatories. The jury had listened to this cross-examination more attentively than to any other part of the evidence, and it was clear that the cool and collected manner in which the prisoner had sifted the testimony of his former master had produced no small effect on several of the jurors. When Harding ceased, Walter Harrison turned to Beauchamp, and the eyes not only of the whole spectators but of his fellow prisoners were fixed upon him. "Mr. Beauchamp," he said, "I am not going to do what they call cross-examine you, because I am sure you will tell the truth like a gentleman. But once, when we were talking about catching these fellows, you told me as much as that you had overheard what I said on that bad night to old Billy Small. Will you have the goodness to let those gentlemen up there know what it all was?" Beauchamp detailed the whole, and having suffered a brief cross-examination on the part of the other prisoners, he was allowed to retire. The evidence now given, together with a declaration of Walter Harrison, closed the case for the Crown. But the prisoners entered on their defence. Smithson, who knew too well the proceedings of a court of justice to believe that he could mend his condition by his own oratory, declined saying anything, except that he was innocent, to which he added all those ordinary but vehement asseverations which render the bar of a court of justice an altar to impiety, whence falsehood and blasphemy reek continually up in the sight of heaven. The woman appeared strongly inclined to speak in her own defence, but her words were drowned in an hysterical burst of sobbing, and Harding, with the young sailor, were left to address the court for themselves. The speech of the first was to consummate a piece of special pleading as ever was drawn up in ancient or modern days. On the evidence against himself he commented with the utmost acuteness, and pointed out that there was no direct proof that he had ever been in the house of the unhappy man who had been murdered, except that afforded by the declaration of the young man, Walter Harrison, whose acknowledgment of participation in the crime and evident desire to escape the punishment, by laying the whole of it upon other people, he trusted that the jury would remember and consider before they attached any weight to his testimony. Mr. Beauchamp, he continued, had never seen him in the house, or near the house. At least, though he threw out a suspicion, yet he had not attempted to swear that he had beheld him there. And although William Small, an acknowledged smuggler, had declared that he came to his cottage in the boat with Mr. Beauchamp and the rest, yet he did not state whether he was there as a voluntary agent or as under compulsion. In regard to the footmarks in the house, he argued that they could not be held as proving anything, for in the number of men who might be supposed to commit such a crime as that, how many would be found with a foot as nearly the same size as his? Had his clothes been found bloody, he asked? Had any of the implements of robbery and housebreaking been found upon him? No. And the whole case against him, he contended, rested alone upon the very doubtful testimony of the young sailor, and the fact of his having paid the freight of the cutter with a note which had been in the possession of Mr. Timms. He now paused for a moment, and after having taken breath and eyed the jury to see what effect his oratory had produced, he went on in a solemn and serious manner. "Gentlemen of the jury, having now commented upon the evidence against me, and stripped it of all those magnifying circumstances with which human malice is ever too prone to swell the charge against a person once suspected, having shown upon how slender a foundation rests the case in respect to myself, I will proceed to explain to you fully and honestly every circumstance that appears at all doubtful in my conduct, trusting that the confession of some errors which I deeply regret will not prejudice you against me in the consideration of the present accusation. When I came down to Emberton with Mr. Beauchamp, against whom I do not pretend to say a word, although he was somewhat imaginative in his ways of acting and thinking, I had frequent occasion to go on his business to the house of the unhappy man who has been so cruelly murdered, and where I was always received with a degree of kindness which certainly would never have prompted the base return which I am accused of having made. I there became acquainted with the young woman at the bar. An attachment grew up between us, and having, upon some speculative principles of general utility, which I now acknowledge to have been foolish and wrong, taken up a prejudice against marriage, I obtained her promise to elope with me without any ceremony of the church. In one service or another I had amassed a considerable sum, and her wages also were long in arrear. She with difficulty obtained payment from her master, and it was determined that we should go off together. Our plans, however, were hurried by Mr. Beauchamp's sudden departure from Emberton, and hearing that there was a French vessel on the coast, we resolved to set off that ill-starred night. Just as I was about to proceed to Ribery to meet her at the appointed hour, I found her in the streets of Emberton, whither she had been sent by her master to lawyer Johnston's for some stamps, and we were returning to Ribery in order to procure her clothes, when we met 3 men dragging along Mr. Beauchamp, apparently dead. I did not well know what to do, and in a scuffle with the men I was, of course, overpowered. They treated me humanely, however, I must say, and told me that they neither wished to hurt me nor the gentleman they had got, and if I chose to go quietly along with them till they were safe in France, whither they were going, they would then set me at liberty. But they vowed, with many imprecations, that they would not leave any one behind who could give information against them. I learned from this that they had committed some crime, but the impossibility of resistance, the desire of getting to France, and the hope of doing some good to my master, all induced me to yield quietly, and I accordingly got into the boat with them, and we went off. By the time we had reached the smuggler's cottage, however, I had learned enough to show me the horrid crime that had been committed, and before I had been there a quarter of an hour, this young man beside me, whom I have reason to believe was the principal actor in the Ribery tragedy, whispered to me that I was in for it, as he termed it, and that, fair weather or foul, I must sail out the voyage with him and his companions. I asked him what he meant, and he then showed me that if I went back to London, or peached, as he called it, I should certainly be suspected as accessory to what had happened. I was overcome with the horror of my situation, and on my remonstrating and begging him to allow me to depart, he threatened, if I said another word, to make it out so that I should appear the principal in the murder. My courage and my resolution failed, and, weakly consenting to go with them, I suffered myself to be led on blindly and do what they liked. The freight of the ship even I was compelled to pay, which I did with a £1 note that Sarah there had received from her poor master the night before, and had given me to keep. After our arrival in France, I gave myself up to despair. My hopes and prospects seemed utterly ruined, and to keep away thought, I gambled deeply. Fortune, however, favoured me, and I won large sums. Suddenly the news that Bow Street officers were pursuing us in Paris added new anxieties to my mind, and I often thought to give myself up and tell all I knew. The apprehension that I would do so, it seems, induced the other prisoner beside me to be beforehand with me, and on the night that I was taken, when I heard his voice without, and saw Mr. Beauchamp enter the room, I certainly made a desperate defence, having no hope of being able to establish my innocence against the conspiracy that was evidently got up to make me the scapegoat. This, gentlemen, is the plain, straightforward story of what really happened. You must all see that I have had no time to make up such a tale, as I knew not what evidence would be produced against me. There stands the only witness I could bring forward to prove the truth of my story, but she, included in the same false charge, is prevented from giving evidence in my favour." "It is all true! It is all true!" cried the unhappy girl, weeping bitterly. And Harding proceeded, "I have little more to add, gentlemen. Mr. Beauchamp's evidence is generally correct, though he was mistaken in 1 or 2 particulars. But I trust that you will allow the good character that he has himself given me to counterbalance the assertion that he has erroneously made. In conclusion, I have only to say that my very heart and soul revolts at the thought of the crime with which I am charged, and although I have been culpable in some things, let me trust that my sins have been sufficiently punished already by their consequences, and that a jury of my countrymen will not incur the awful responsibility of condemning an innocent man for a crime that never entered his thoughts." With a fine person and graceful action, Harding delivered this address with so much effect that a murmur of approbation filled the court when he concluded, and it was evident that the opinion of the jury was strongly affected by what he had said. The gentlemen of the bar, however, whispered together with a significant smile, and one then remarked to another, "He brought in the girl devilish neatly. The fellow must have some good in him for that." "Pooh!" replied the more experienced counsel to whom he spoke. "He could not have made up his own story without it." The judge now repressed the noise in the court, and the young sailor came nearer to the bar to address the jury. "Gentlemen," he said, "I can't make you a fine speech like this man, Harding, who, I begin to think, is the devil himself, for none but the father of lies could have got up such a string of them, do you see? I told the whole truth in my declaration before the magistrates, and as you all know well enough, if what he has said was true, and I had wanted to betray him to screen myself, I might have been king's evidence as the folks wanted me. My lord the judge knows that, and everyone else. And so I should have saved my life to a certainty and pocketed the reward. No, I had no such thought in my head, do you see? And now, gentlemen, I will tell you truly how it all happened. It makes little odds to me whether you hang me or not, for I shall not live 3 months if you don't. And death is just as bitter tomorrow as today, though I never feared him much, somehow. The thing is this, gentlemen, I have a poor mother, a widow, living in Emberton, and to see her next to starving always has been a sore heart to me. Well, there were only 3 people in all the world that ever were very kind to me. The first was my mother, who forgave me all my faults, and loved me notwithstanding all the sorrows I brought her. The next was Captain William Delaware, who, when I got into a scrape about poaching, and might have been sent to the hulks, took me aboard his own ship, treated me as kindly as possible, and sent me back with a better character than ever I had before. The next was Mr. Henry Beauchamp, though I always took his name to be Burrell. He saved my life at the risk of his own, had me doctored and tended, was kind to me and my mother, gave me advice and encouragement, which would have been a blessing if I had remembered it, and promised me help if I behaved well. But I did not behave well, for that cursed villain, his servant, Harding there, did me more harm than all his master could say did me good. He was always at me about what he called the unequal distribution of property, and it was very natural to get from thinking that other folk had no right to their property, to thinking that one should take it from them the best way one could, and so it turned out. I have told all about the robbery in my declaration, but I never could tell, gentlemen, what a turn it gave me when I found they had murdered the old man. Aye, when they first came down with their hands all bloody, I shall never forget it, sleeping or waking. However, that I got over, though it was always like a red-hot coal lying at my heart. But then I thought that sometime it would go out of my head, till one day I went into a shop in Paris to sell some of the things for them that they had stolen, when they set fire to the lady's house upon the hill, and there I took up an English newspaper and I saw all about the murder. That was bad enough, but when I found out that a set of rogues and fools had laid the blame of what we had done upon the noblest gentleman in all the country, who would not hurt a fly, if it were not when he is alongside of an enemy, when I saw that, and thought how it would break his gallant heart, and that of his good father, and poor Miss Blanche's too, and remembered what Captain Delaware had done for me, and what his father and Miss Blanche had done for my poor mother, why, gentlemen, I thought I should have gone mad. Well, I believe I was mad, till, as good luck would have it, I found out Mr. Beauchamp, and told him all about it, and offered, if he would not take odds against the 2 fellows, but would go with me and face them singly, I offered, I say, to give them up, and myself too. Well, he told me of the king's proclamation, and promised of pardon, and all that, but I told him I would be tried too, like the rest, and away we went and took them, though I got shot in the shoulder, and Mr. Beauchamp in the face. Now, gentlemen, you all know that I was left behind in Paris, and came over here of my own accord, and gave myself up without any one telling me, and so you may believe the rest of my story or not, as you like. All I want is to clear Captain Delaware, for he is a noble gentleman, and a good officer, and a kind-hearted man. God bless him for ever. Harding had been really eloquent, for from the adaptation of his story to the evidence produced immediately before, it was beyond doubt that he had poured forth his long address upon the spur of the occasion. Walter Harrison, however, was not eloquent, and if there had been anything like eloquence in his speech, it was the eloquence of passionate sincerity. Still the tale produced a deep impression. Harding's alone, the transient one. In the case of the latter, the jury and the spectators have felt that the account was plausible and might be true. But when Walter Harrison concluded his rough oration, there was not a man in all the court that doubted his assertions. There was a momentary pause, and then one more person murmured, "Poor fellow!" At length the judge summed up the evidence with that clear, straightforward, noble impartiality, that dignified and equitable firmness, which is so universally characteristic of an English judge. He noticed Harding's defence, and gave him the full credit of every probability that existed in favour of the story he had told. But he noticed also the singular conduct of Walter Harrison, pointed out the minute resemblance between the declaration he had made in Paris and that which he had made in England, and the harmony of the whole of it with both his conduct towards Beauchamp and the conversation he had held with the smuggler. Nevertheless, he said, there was a peculiar feature in the case which greatly affected it, and he begged the jury to give the prisoners the advantage of any doubt that might thence arise in their minds. This peculiar feature was, that Walter Harrison, having refused to become King's evidence, the prisoners had not had an opportunity of cross-examining him, as they might have done any other witness. At the same time, his declaration could not fail to have a considerable effect upon the minds of the jury in regard to the other prisoners, as well as to himself, and therefore it was to be received cautiously from the peculiarity adverted to. The judge's exposition of the law, and his classification of the evidence adduced, was clear, judicious, and impartial, and on dismissing the jury to deliberate, he called upon them to cast away from their minds the remembrance of everything but what they had heard in that court, and never to forget that the duty they were then called upon to perform involved the most awful responsibility which it is possible for a human being to undertake. The eyes of each of the prisoners were fixed upon the jury box, while the judge addressed the jurors, and it was remarked that in one particular point of the summing up, where the declaration of the young sailor and his conduct throughout the whole transaction were clearly stated, Harding turned extremely pale, and casting down his eyes, remained in deep thought. In a very few minutes the jury reappeared in court, and the foreman announced their verdict of guilty against Smithson, Harding, and his paramour. Not guilty in regard to the young sailor, except on the count referring to the robbery. As the fatal words rang in her ear, the unhappy woman dropped down on the floor of the dock, as if she had been shot. Smithson alone muttered a few words in his peculiar slang, consigning the judge and jury to the place for which his own deeds qualified him much better. Harding remained profoundly silent, and heard not only the announcement of his condemnation, but the awful sentence that followed it, with a calm but steadfast composure. While sentence of death was passing on Harding, Smithson, and Sarah Ings, the head of a woman dressed in deep mourning, pale, haggard, and agitated, but with the traces of former beauty shining through all, was seen gazing eagerly upon the judge, till at length he turned to Walter Harrison, and informed him that, at the suggestion of the King's counsel on the occasion, his sentence should be reserved for farther consideration. At those words a passionate flood of tears were seen to burst forth from the woman's eyes, which had been dry as the desert before, and she hurried eagerly from the court ere the crowd made their way toward the door. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of 30 Years Since by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 38. There are some men so highly gifted with fine and generous feelings that they feel a sort of sympathetic excitement in the trials and behaviours of murderers and highwaymen, prize the rope that hanged a noted criminal, and guard as a relic the implements with which some great crime was perpetrated. We own the narrowness of our own mind in these respects, and turn without reluctance for a time to the fierce and ruthless deeds of men in the last stage of human depravity, to scenes where the same passions and perhaps the same vices had to struggle with the bonds of education and circumstances, and were restrained to crooked and confined passages by all the respects of rank and station and a well-preserved name. On the Saturday morning which succeeded the trial of Harding and his accomplices, the Earl of Ashborough sat waiting for his carriage, which was to be at his door at 9 precisely, in order to whirl him and his niece down to one of his country seats, for the purpose of spending the Christmas holidays with true old English hospitality, as the newspapers termed it, amidst his neighbours and tenants. About 3 weeks had now elapsed since the return of his nephew and the dismissal of Mr. Timms, and agents had been appointed by the Earl to examine into that worthy's accounts, in which they had hitherto made but small progress. The noble lord had in the meanwhile pursued his plan of speaking of his ci devant lawyer, and treating him in every respect with calm and supreme contempt. But Mr. Timms had at the same time proceeded upon his plan also, and scarcely a daily or a weekly newspaper appeared, from that which instructs and bullies the statesman to that which sets the pot-house in a roar, that did not contain some galling allusion to the Earl of Ashborough and his private affairs. His lordship took no notice, but still the same attack went on, and though he spoke not a word upon the business to any one, yet it was evident that the annoyance he felt was sufficient seriously to affect his health. A physician's carriage was seen almost daily at his door, and in the end, it being discovered that the length of time he had spent that year in the dull and smoky atmosphere of London had hurt his constitution, it was determined that he should set out for the country, and not return till his parliamentary duties absolutely compelled his attendance in the House of Peers. The carriage then was ordered, and his lordship, with his usual punctuality, was ready to the moment. The carriage, however, and his lordship's niece were anything but ready to the moment, and the Earl was sitting in attendance upon their will and pleasure, and in no very quiescent mood, when the loud clatter of a horse's feet beneath the windows broke the silence, and in a moment after, a letter, brought by express from the little country town of was put into his hand, together with another, bearing his address in the handwriting of Henry Beauchamp. The first was signed by the sheriff of the county, and went to inform him that a man of the name of Harding, having been that day, at 20 minutes after 3 o'clock, condemned to death for the murder at Ribery, had expressed an earnest wish to see his lordship, and had intimated that, if he was so indulged, he would make disclosures of a very great importance, and which he believed might even save his own life. These facts the sheriff had thought necessary to bring before his lordship, leaving him to judge whether it would be proper or not to comply with the desire of the prisoner. The letter from Beauchamp contained but a few lines, urging his uncle strongly to give immediate attention to the demand of the felon, and Lord Ashborough, in his first burst of angry impatience, threw both the epistles into the fire together. Now, as Lord Ashborough was a man who seldom gave way to such unnecessary displays of vehemence, it was very easy to divine, from his violent demolition of the letters, that he would ultimately do what was required, whatever he might say to the contrary, for, had he not intended to go, there would not have been the slightest use of being angry about the matter. What could the fellow want with him? He asked. It was all nonsense. There could be no reason for his going down, nor could the rascal have any matter of import to relate. But the very fact that his lordship could by no means divine what Harding could want with him, served to the greatest degree to strengthen that principle, or passion, or folly, whichever curiosity may be termed by the learned, what now urged the Earl to travel to the town of . By the time the carriage came up, he had got as far as to think, well, I suppose I must go, and by the time Miss Beauchamp, becloaked and befurred, entered the drawing-room, he had summoned resolution to say, "Had you and the carriage been ready in time, Maria, I should have had a pleasant journey with you down to , instead of an unpleasant one by myself down to . What convenient things blanks are!" He then explained to his niece the circumstances which called him in a different direction from that which he had proposed to follow, and left her the choice of taking the barouche and the old butler, and proceeding at once into the country as they had intended at first, or of going with him in the chariot to the county town of Blank. "Oh, not I, my dear uncle, for the world!" cried Miss Beauchamp. "You surely do not expect me to go and dance at what they call the size ball. No, indeed, I must be excused. The barouche, the old butler, and the country house for me. But remember, I shall expect your lordship to join me in 2 days, for the house is to be full of people, the newspapers tell me, and of course you cannot expect me to act the landlady of the inn when the landlord is away." Lord Ashborough, as a matter of form, scolded his gay niece for her pertness, although he knew her to be incorrigible, and then leaving her to make her own arrangements, which, to say sooth, she had never any great difficulty in doing, he got into his chariot and rolled away in a very different direction from that in which he had previously intended to turn his steps. There is nothing so dry and disgusting on earth as travelling on paper. It is a sort of algebraic locomotion, full of false positions and most uninteresting abbreviations, and therefore, instead of posting on by the side of the Earl of Ashborough, we shall take the liberty of getting into the chaise with him, and while he leans back with his eyes half shut, will gently unbutton the top 2 buttons of his waistcoat, where the lapel folds over the black handkerchief, and, drawing it back, peep in through the window the old Roman wished for, and ascertain what is going on in his lordship's breast. There was once, in the day of Cheops, an Egyptian, who had a remarkably fine poultry yard, in which were all the fowls of all the feathers that Egypt ever saw. One day it so happened that, walking by the side of the Nile, the Egyptian espied an egg, which he immediately took up, and putting it in his breast, he carried it home, and laid it carefully in the nest of a sitting hen. 20 days after, on entering his poultry yard, to his great surprise he found nothing but feathers and a young crocodile, which instantly attacked him also. With great difficulty the Egyptian freed himself of the destroyer of his hens, and when he died, he directed in his will that on the formal bandage of his mummy there should be written, both in the hieroglyphic and the vulgar character, "Beware how you hatch a crocodile's egg in your poultry yard." Cheops, when he heard it, laughed, but one day, when he was going to give way to his revenge, contrary to the best interests both of himself and his people, contrary to wisdom and policy and justice and good faith, he caught himself saying, "Beware how you hatch a crocodile's egg in your poultry yard," and ever after that, when he found a violent passion springing up in his breast, his instant address to his own heart was, "Beware how you hatch a crocodile's egg in your poultry yard." Now the Earl of Ashborough had lately discovered that in pursuit of his right honourable revenge against Sir Sidney Delaware, he had hatched a crocodile's egg in his poultry yard, and though he certainly repented having done so, in exact proportion to the consequent evil it had brought upon himself, he, of course, felt his hatred towards Sir Sidney Delaware increased in the same degree. Lord Ashborough would not have given his right hand, or anything the least like it, to have had full vengeance on the Delaware family, for he was a man that valued both his hands highly, and would not have parted with either of them. But whereas he would, a month or 2 before, have given a considerable portion of his golden stores, which were the next thing to drops of his blood, he would now have given double the sum to see the ruin of the race he hated. As he lay back then in the chariot, he thought over all the events, and could not help hoping that some circumstance might yet give him an opportunity of balancing the long account of whose vexations and uncomforts which had fallen upon him, in, with, from, through, and by the affairs of Sir Sidney Delaware, and also of inflicting upon that gentleman and his family evils in a like proportion. At all events, he thought, and it was the most consolatory reflection that he had been able to find, at all events, they have been forced to leave the country, and have most probably gone to America, so that all danger of such a degrading connection being formed by Beauchamp is now at an end. So far, therefore, my labour and anxiety has not been in vain, and I may flatter myself at least that one great object has been gained, if not the whole. There was another slight gleam of hope or expectation flickering over the dying lamp of the Earl's former designs, if one may use the term, It was a hopeless hope, the stout swimmer's last gasp, yet without it Lord Ashborough would probably never have attended to Harding's request. Hating all the Delaware race as he did, he had not been able to persuade himself fully that Captain Delaware was entirely innocent, notwithstanding the convincing proofs that Beauchamp had laid before him. And he now thought it possible, barely possible, that the murderer Harding might have something to say which would in some way inculpate William Delaware. All these ideas rolled in the Earl's mind like the morning clouds of spring, misty and vague, and varying in shape and size, though still keeping one general character, till night came and he fell asleep. He awoke about 8 o'clock as the carriage stopped in the county town of , and looking out, saw the bright lamp over the ever-open glass doors of the principal inn, and the waiters rushing forth to seize upon the inmate of the carriage and four. His lordship's agility not being what it had been, he entered the house of many tenants with slow and dignified steps, and taking possession of the best apartment, demanded whether Mr. Beauchamp was still there. The waiter replied in the affirmative, and in a few minutes the greeting of the uncle and nephew had taken place. As neither had dined, and Beauchamp's dinner was just upon the table, the Earl became his guest, while a servant was dispatched to the prison in order to notify his arrival, in compliance with the request of Harding. As far as possible, Lord Ashborough never disturbed his appetite in the exercise of its functions by any conversation which might become disagreeable, and consequently he abstained with infinite forbearance from touching upon the proceedings in regard to the Ribery affair, till biscuits and wine stood upon the table by themselves. He then, however, asked his nephew how the events of the assizes had gone. Beauchamp, in reply, gave him a succinct account of all that had taken place, without forgetting to mention that the bill against Captain Delaware had been thrown out by the grand jury with every mark of indignant rejection, and on seeing his uncle bite his lip, he added, "So now every shade of doubt and suspicion has been removed from the character of William Delaware, and I trust very soon to see him and his family return to England, and resume that station in society for which they were born, and in which your lordship's liberal conduct in regard to the annuity will enable them to move with greater ease." Lord Ashborough turned rather pale, but he replied at once, "I trust not, sir, I trust not." "And pray, why not?" demanded Beauchamp, with more surprise at the frank avowal of such a wish than at the existence thereof. "I will tell you, Henry Beauchamp," replied the Earl. "I will tell you. It is on your account, I say, that I hope not. I have not chosen to speak to you, since your return, upon your previous conduct toward this family of Delawares, because I trusted that circumstances would have removed them forever from our neighbourhood. But now that there means a possibility of their returning, I must tell you that I have never been ignorant from the first of your masquerading visit to the country. And I must further say that a report has reached me of your trifling with the old man's daughter. That you would ever dream of marrying the girl, of course I do not believe, but the very report is unpleasant, and might injure your views in a fitting alliance." Beauchamp had a great deal of trouble to master the mixture of personal anger and indignation which his uncle's speech had created in his bosom, and to reduce his reply to terms of respect and moderation. He succeeded, however, in putting out a good deal of the fire ere he answered. "My lord, as far as a kindred interest in my affairs and prospects goes, I feel that your zeal on the present occasion must of course add to the gratitude and affection I entertain toward you, for a long train of kindnesses in the past. But you will pardon me if I say that a certain line must be drawn between anxiety in regard to my welfare and dictation in regard to my conduct, for beyond that line I can permit no one to trespass." Lord Ashborough turned very red, and he replied hastily, "All these are mere fine words, Mr. Beauchamp. What I wish to know simply is, do you or do you not intend to marry this girl?" "That, my lord, is a question," replied Beauchamp, still bridling his anger, "which no man on earth has any right to ask me, and to it I shall give you no reply. But that you may not at all deceive yourself, let me add that if you desire to know whether I think Miss Delaware fitted by station and circumstances to become my wife, I will reply at once that a man of much higher rank and much greater fortune than myself should think himself honoured could he obtain her hand." "Enough, sir, enough," cried Lord Ashborough. "You have said quite enough. In regard to my right to question you, I slightly differ with you in opinion, inasmuch as my conduct will of course be regulated towards you by the answers you have made. And now, Henry Beauchamp, I have to tell you that you will do, of course, as you like, but if these Delawares ever return to England, and may the sea swallow the scheming beggars ere they reach the shore, but if ever they should come, and you pursue your foolish conduct toward that girl, I leave every farthing which I can, by any means, alienate from the estates attached to the title, to the most distant connection I have, rather than to yourself. Mark me, you throw away at least 20,000 per annum, and at the same time I cast you off for ever, and will never see you more." "My lord," replied Beauchamp in a firm tone, "although you have yet shown me no right to ask the question you did ask, you have at least afforded me a good reason for answering it more pointedly than I have hitherto done; and therefore, that you may make any dispositions in regard to your property which you think fit without delay or uncertainty, I tell you plainly and positively that if ever Miss Delaware does return to this country, I shall at once offer her my hand, and if she should not return immediately, I will seek her through every country in Europe for the same purpose. Now, my lord, having said this much, allow me to remind you, sir, that I am not a man whom the loss even of £20,000 a year can awe into doing one single thing that he would not otherwise have done, nor leave one regret upon his mind for doing that which he thinks right. The loss of your lordship's affection and society cuts deeper, and will be painful under any circumstances, but I cannot help thinking that on this point at least you will see cause to change your determination." "Never, sir, never," cried Lord Ashborough, whose passion had got into the white stage. "Never while I live," and ringing the bell violently, he threw open the door and retired to his apartments. Beauchamp took 2 or 3 turns up and down the room, told his uncle's servant, who appeared, that he would find him in his own room, and then sat down to contemplate all that had just occurred. At all events, he thought, after he had revolved the whole particulars for several minutes, at all events, it is a very disagreeable business done and over. It must have come sooner or later, and however painful it may be to give such deep offence to a person toward whom I have many debts of gratitude, yet of course this was a point upon which I could yield nothing. His lordship, I think, will yield something, and if he relent on the point of excommunication, he may enrich the first chimney sweeper he meets, for aught I care. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of 30 Years Since by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 39. Lord Ashborough's servant found him pale and exhausted, for the first energy of anger had passed away, and the languor which it leaves behind had taken possession of a frame already weakened by an organic disease, the attacks of which had lately been more frequent and severe than they had ever proved before. "Well," said the Earl, as the man entered, "have you been to the prison?" "I sent Johnstone, my lord," replied the valet. "I thought your lordship might want me." "Well, well," cried the Earl impatiently, "what does Johnstone say?" "The governor sends his respects, my lord," answered the valet, "and although it is past the hour, he will of course admit your lordship, especially as the man has asked several times, he says, whether you had arrived or not." "Order the carriage," said the Earl. "But stay, is it far to the prison?" "Not 200 yards," replied the servant, and Lord Ashborough declared he would walk thither. The valet, however, took the liberty of remonstrating, with that tender interest in his master's health which he thought might add £200 or £300 to the legacy he firmly expected to find in the Earl's will. "I hope you will remember, my lord, that you are not well. Sir Henry said you were not to make any great exertion or take too much exercise. And your lordship is looking very pale tonight." "I dare say I do," answered the Earl. "However, I must go. Give me my cloak, Peregrine, and call Johnston to show me the way." The valet, of course, made no farther opposition, and Lord Ashborough was soon on his way to the county jail, with a footman lighting him on, for the town was very dark. And, with a most fervent wish in his heart that the felon he was going to see might place it in his power to fix at least one damning spot of suspicion on the name of Delaware, the governor of the prison received him with deep respect, and doors opened and keys turned for the Earl of Ashborough throughout the long passages and chilly courts of the county jail. "We have given this man every convenience in our power," said the governor, as he led Lord Ashborough along toward the condemned cells, "because he seemed to be a person of superior mind, and he assured the sheriff so earnestly that he had something to communicate to your lordship which might probably influence his majesty in regard to his fate, that it was thought indispensable to trouble your lordship on the occasion." "Pray, has he seen Mr. Beauchamp since his condemnation?" demanded the Earl. "No, sir, nor has he expressed any wish to do so," answered the governor. "But the sheriff thought it best to consult that gentleman ere he troubled you. This is the cell, my lord. Here, Nixon, open the door. I will attend your lordship's return in the waiting-room, and the turnkey will be at the door when you wish to come out of the cell. Mr. Harding," he added, as the door was opened, "here is the Lord of Ashborough, kindly come to see you. Stand away from the doors, sirs," continued the governor to two of his satellites, "and leave the prisoner to speak with the Earl at liberty." The culprit rose as Lord Ashborough entered, looking somewhat annoyed, however, at the noise made by his fetters as he did so. He was composed and calm as usual, but the hollow eye and sunken cheek betrayed the secret of the heart within, and showed that his stoicism, as all stoicism probably ever has been, was all on the surface. "Your lordship is very kind," he said in a quiet, tranquil tone, "to attend so promptly to my request." "The information sent me by the sheriff," replied the Earl, "made me hold it as a duty to come without loss of time. But let me know, what have you to communicate with me?" "I have first to make a request, my lord," answered Harding, who knew Lord Ashborough far better than Lord Ashborough knew himself, and therefore counted his expressions in regard to duty, etc., at exactly their true value. "When you have granted or denied my petition, I will tell you what I have farther to communicate." "And pray, what may your petition be?" asked the Earl. "I must not waste time in many words, sir, for it is short." "No one should know that better than myself, my lord," replied the prisoner. "But my petition is simply that you would personally apply to his majesty for my pardon." The Earl was surprised, but not so much as might have been expected, for he anticipated some discovery which might give the culprit a claim to mercy. "Your request is a most extraordinary one, my good friend," he replied, "considering the evidence which has been brought against you. Nevertheless, I will do as you desire, if you will give me any excuse for doing so. In short, if you are not the real offender and can point out who is, or if you only participated in the crime which another, more criminal than yourself, led you to, or committed with his own hand, and if you can give me any proof, or can lead in any way to the detection and punishment of the guilty, I shall feel myself justified in pleading strongly in your behalf." "Sorry I am to say, my lord," answered Harding coolly, "that I can do none of all these things." "Then, sir, in the name of everything impudent," exclaimed the Earl angrily, "how came you to ask me to plead for you to his majesty?" "I think I can show your lordship a strong reason for doing so," replied Harding, with a slight sneer curling his lip. "And I must then leave it to your lordship's ingenuity to discover some motive to assign to his majesty for granting me his gracious pardon, although let me remark that you may well say the case is a very doubtful one, for certain I am that not one of the 12 jurors who condemned me did not lie down on his bed last night with a doubting heart as to my guilt or innocence." The Earl listened with no slight degree of anger to the prisoner's cool and impudent harangue, but curiosity kept him silent, or at least taught him to conceal his contempt and indignation, till he had heard the circumstances to which the culprit alluded. "Well, sir, well," he said, as Harding paused. "Pray, what are the extraordinary motives which you suppose will prove capable of inducing me to furnish his Majesty with reasons for pardoning a convicted felon? What is there, sir, that should tempt me to undertake such a task?" "Simply, my lord, that scrupulous care for your lordship's reputation," Harding replied, "which you have displayed through life." Lord Ashborough laughed aloud, but Harding maintained the same calm and somewhat sneering aspect, as if he had made up his mind to every turn that his conference with the Earl might take, and could not be turned aside from his direct object for the moment by either scorn or anger. "And pray, sir," demanded his noble visitor, when he had exhausted his scoffing laugh, "pray, what has my reputation to do with your situation? Do you intend to accuse me, in your last dying speech and confession, of having committed the murder myself, or having aided you to commit it?" "Neither one nor the other, my lord," answered the prisoner; "but if I do make any confession at all, which will depend upon your lordship's conduct, I intend to state that the robbery was first suggested to me by the following letter, written to me by your lordship's lawyer on your account, in order to persuade me to delay or carry off a sum of money which my master was to receive through the hands of the old man at Ribery." Lord Ashborough turned deadly pale, and taking a step forward, while he advanced his hand toward the paper which Harding held, he exclaimed, "Let me see, sir, let me see." "Your pardon, my lord," said the prisoner, drawing back the paper. "One does not usually give such valuable documents out of one's own hand. I will read it to you, however." And in a calm, sustained voice, he proceeded to treat the ears of Lord Ashborough, sentence by sentence, with the whole of that letter which had been formerly written to him by Mr. Peter Timms, in regard to the money which Beauchamp had expected from London, to pay off the annuity on Sir Sidney Delaware's estate. "Your lordship will see," continued the prisoner, "that such a letter was very well calculated to induce me to commit a robbery. You will see also that Mr. Timms uses your lordship as his authority throughout, and I look upon myself as extremely lucky in having always preserved this letter in the lining of my waistcoat, as it now gives me the hope that so highly respected and honourable a nobleman as yourself may interest himself in my favour." Now, in Lord Ashborough's mind there was a great portion of that very same principle which had led Beauchamp to make the most uncompromising declaration of his purposes towards Blanche Delaware, as soon as he found that his uncle held out a threat upon the subject. Or, as the matter would be explained in one word by the phrenologists, who, if they have discovered nothing else, have at least, by the clearness of their definitions and their classification of human passions, rendered great services to moral philosophy, Lord Ashborough had no small development of combativeness in his brain, and the very idea of being bullied by a felon into demanding the royal mercy for a murderer, without one plausible motive to allege, instantly armed him to resist, though at the same time he felt terribly the additional wound his character might receive from such a paper being published as that which Harding had read. "You are mistaken, sir," he replied sternly. "You are entirely mistaken in your anticipations. The letter was totally unauthorised by me, and the rascal who wrote it, for that and several similar acts, has been dismissed from my employment." Harding heard him with the same cool smile, and then replied, "Your lordship's memory is short, I know, but luckily I can refresh it, for Mr. Timms has favoured me only last night with this authentic and original copy of the letter, containing numerous corrections and improvements in your lordship's own handwriting." Lord Ashborough saw that the day was lost, and that his discarded agent had triumphed. He had not committed himself in regard to the Delawares, it is true, but he had committed himself hopelessly in regard to the very man who now stood before him, a convicted felon, and he felt that the reputation of which he was proud just in proportion as he deserved it, was gone for ever. He made no reply, however, but with a slight and, as Harding fancied, scornful movement of the lip, he turned suddenly toward the door, struck it sharply with his hand, and exclaimed, "Open the door, turnkey, open the door." It was instantly thrown wide to give him exit, but Lord Ashborough never went out. The one word, "Villain," was all that he pronounced in the hearing of the turnkey, and then fell forward at once across the threshold of the door. All was now confusion. Both gaolers started forward to raise the nobleman, whom they believed to have tripped his foot in the doorway. Harding gave one longing look toward the open door and the embarrassed turnkeys, but then, turning his eyes to the fetters upon his own limbs, he sat down with a sigh of infinite compassion for himself, while the Earl was raised and the door locked. "He has fainted, Mr. Jones," said one of the gaolers. "Here, take his feet, and help me to carry him along to the waiting-room." "He looks deadly pale," replied the other, stooping forward and gazing in Lord Ashborough's face, while he aided to bear the Earl onward through the passage. "He looks mighty like a dead man." The consternation of the governor of the prison was excessive when he saw the state of the noble visitor, and while physicians were sent for from every quarter, he himself pressed his hand upon the Earl's wrist and upon his heart, but no pulse made itself felt in return, and all the usual restoratives were applied in vain. A moment or two after, the surgeon of the prison appeared, but as soon as he beheld the countenance of him to whose aid he was called, he shook his head, declaring that he believed him to be dead. He attempted to bleed him, however, but by this time no blood was to be obtained, and 2 or 3 medical men from different parts of the town, arriving soon after, confirmed the opinion of the first. Nevertheless, various means were still resorted to in the hope of restoring animation, while messengers were dispatched to the different inns to ascertain at which the Earl had alighted, and to inform his relations and servants of what had occurred. Henry Beauchamp was still musing over the fire when Lord Ashborough's valet opened the door, and, with a face of grief and terror, extremely well compounded, exclaimed, "Sir, I am sorry to tell you that my lord has been taken very ill at the prison." Beauchamp started up, and took his hat, while the servant added, "Indeed, they seem to fear, sir, that he is dead." "Good God!" cried Beauchamp, as he rushed past the man. "Good God!" And darting downstairs, he proceeded with rapid steps to the prison, into which, on giving his name, he was instantly admitted. He found what had been Lord Ashborough extended on a table with a pillow under his head, and the surgeon still busy about the body. But one glance at his uncle's countenance showed him that the spirit had fled, and for a moment he gazed upon him without question or remark, while busy memory did her work, and gathered from the past every kind act of the dead, to build him up a monument in his nephew's heart. "How did this happen, sir?" demanded Beauchamp at length, in a low tone, as if afraid of disturbing that deep sleep that had fallen upon his uncle. The governor told all he knew, and Beauchamp anxiously requested that the prisoner Harding might be asked if he could assign any cause for the accident that had befallen the Earl. One of the turnkeys was accordingly sent to his cell, and while he was absent, Beauchamp, perceiving that the medical men were addressing all their means of restoration to the head, informed them that Lord Ashborough had been for some years subject to spasms of the heart. "If that be the case, then, sir," replied one of them, "we may abandon the attempt, as the Earl is certainly dead." "Nevertheless," replied Beauchamp, "leave no means untried, while there is even the most remote hope." The surgeon shook his head, but still made some more efforts, and the turnkey, returning almost immediately from the condemned cell, reported that the prisoner could only be brought to say that the Earl had fallen into a violent passion, and that he himself desired not to be farther troubled upon the subject. After a pause of a few moments more, the principal surgeon again addressed Beauchamp, saying, "As I imagine, sir, from your manner, that you are a near relation of the Earl, I feel my duty to tell you positively that he is no more, and that to continue all these efforts in your presence would be but to harrow up your feelings for no purpose. All men must die, and the nobleman will never have to endure that pang again." Beauchamp bowed his head, and crossing his arms upon his bosom, remained for a few moments in silence. Then, begging that one of the younger surgeons would remain with the body all night, and that the elder person who had addressed him would accompany him to the inn, he added a few words of course to the governor of the prison, and departed from the chamber of the dead. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of 30 Years Since by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. We generally, through life, write the actions of each of our friends and acquaintances on the two sides of one leaf in the book of memory, the good upon one side and the bad upon the other, so that it is scarcely possible to see both at once. With an amiable weakness, however, man most frequently suffers the death of any one he has known to turn the leaf for ever, and reads the character of him that is no more, as if the good were alone recorded. Beauchamp's heart would not suffer him to do otherwise, and after he had spoken with the surgeon in regard to several points of all the sad ceremonies that were to follow, he sat down in solitude, giving way to feelings that were far more bitter than he had anticipated. Even had he not felt his uncle's loss deeply, on the ground of personal regard, there was in his bosom another motive for regret which would have pained him much. He asked himself whether the angry discussion which had taken place between himself and the Earl so shortly before the decease of the latter might not have hastened that catastrophe, and although he was obliged to acknowledge that, were the same circumstances to come over again, he could not and would not act otherwise than he had done, yet he was deeply grieved that the disagreement should have taken place so immediately previous to the death of his uncle, and that they had parted from each other for ever in anger and ill will. We shall pass over Beauchamp's grief, however, merely saying that he grieved sincerely. Nor shall we dwell upon the details of the funeral of the Earl of Ashborough, nor treat the reader to the full, true, and particular account of the execution of 3 criminals, against whom we have seen that a jury of their countrymen pronounced a just verdict, and to whom a judge had awarded a righteous punishment. Suffice it that they died. In regard to Harding alone, a few words must be said. To all appearance, he met his fate with the same determined coolness which he had shown through life, rendered perhaps a degree more stern and intense from the awful situation in which he was placed. One circumstance, and one circumstance alone, seemed to show that the drop of better feeling which almost every man has at the bottom of his heart was not entirely polluted by the poisonous streams that flowed around it. On the night before his execution, after having obdurately rejected those religious consolations which were offered with persevering piety by several zealous clergymen, he suddenly desired to speak with 2 magistrates, and then in their presence made a full and clear confession of all the particulars connected with the murder at Ribery, confirming in every point the testimony of Walter Harrison. This he signed in the presence of the magistrates, and caused them to affix their names as witnesses. Which being done, he added, "I have made this confession, gentlemen, because the act for which I am to die has been attributed to a young gentleman who had nothing to do with it, and because that gentleman, being well calculated to do service to himself and his country, if every shade of imputation be removed from his character, I think the general considerations of utility require, or rather," he said, breaking off abruptly the tirade in which he was about to indulge, "or rather, I do it because I have learned what mental as well as bodily suffering is, and therefore would spare it to another where there is no occasion for its infliction. So now, gentlemen, I have done with this world for ever, and I wish you good night." In the various accounts of the execution, which every one must have seen in the newspapers, a number of contradictory statements appeared. Some journals affirming that Harding had died, maintaining his innocence to the last; some, with more truth, that he had made a full confession. His statement, however, was immediately sent up to London, properly authenticated, together with the case of Walter Harrison, and both were laid before the Home Secretary for the consideration of His Majesty. The necessary measures for issuing a free pardon to the young sailor were immediately taken, and when it was presented for signature, the great personage paused for a moment to ask some questions in regard to Captain Delaware, expressing considerable indignation that so grave a charge should have been brought against a distinguished officer on such light grounds. Had that officer not run off, he said, a point of which it may be as well to take no notice, had he not run off, it might have been necessary to make him some compensation. That was a great error to flinch from trial. A brave man, too, a very brave man. Sir A. B., the judge who presided at the trial, sir, replied the secretary, informs me that it was lucky he did make his escape, alleging that he would have been hanged to a certainty before evidence of his innocence could have been procured, so that your majesty has, at all events, saved a good officer. Always a great gain, sir, replied the personage whom he addressed, and if that was the case, Captain Delaware did very right. Always stay in the ship till the very last moment, but don't go down with her if you can help it. With these observations, the pardon was signed and dispatched to the country town where the young sailor was still confined. Being set at liberty, he immediately took his way on foot toward the village of Emberton, where so many of our scenes have been laid. It was by this time winter, and a hard frost rendered the road firm and dry, so that Walter Harrison, though greatly debilitated, walked on better than might have been expected. Night, however, had fallen ere he reached Emberton, and glad he was that darkness hid him from the cold and abhorrent eyes he must otherwise have encountered in the streets. But what tongue could tell the many painful and thrilling memories that were awakened in his bosom by every spot as he passed through his native town, and saw again all the scenes of youth and innocence, as he marked the various resorts of his boyish hours, and felt that a night far darker than that through which he wandered had fallen over his life for ever. At the door of his mother's cottage garden he paused, and gazed wistfully over the house with feelings that would scarcely let him enter the gate. There was a light, however, within, and his step over the gravel of the footpath had instantly caught the mother's unerring ear. The light moved, the door was thrown open, and the worn and weary lad, weighed down with sin and sickness and sorrow, was pressed in his mother's arms, and his cold cheek bathed in her tears. It was long ere either could speak, and for nearly half an hour the young sailor sat gazing upon the fire, while thick recollections of all the past held him dull and voiceless. All the time his mother stood by his side, and fixed her eyes upon him, tracing every line that remorse had written, and every hue that sickness had spread over his face. But at length she laid her hand upon his arm and said, "Walter, my beloved boy, we must go hence. You must not stay in this hateful place, which has seen our ruin, our poverty, and our shame. We must go across the sea, and I will lead you to a place that you will like to see." "You forget, mother, you forget," said the youth, with a deep sigh. "People travel not without money, neither can they live without it in foreign countries more than here. I am sure you do not think that I am going to take the reward the people offered me for giving up the murderers. No, no, I will not take a price for their blood." "I would not have you, Walter," cried his mother eagerly. "I would not have you touch it with the tip of a finger if they offered you a world of gold on such an account. But fear not, my boy, I have the means. Look here, what I received but yesterday, 200 golden sovereigns, and this kind letter, and the deed of annuity to you and me for £100 a year, as long as either of us live, charged upon the estates of Mr. Henry Beauchamp." "God bless him," said the youth fervently. "God bless him." "God will bless him, my boy," replied the widow. "God will bless him and make him happy, I am sure, for if ever there was a friend to the friendless, it is Mr. Beauchamp. Only 3 days after the trial he sent me this," and she put into her son's hands a letter in which Henry Beauchamp explained to her that the young sailor having been severely wounded in turning away a pistol which had been directed toward his head, he was not only bound, but pleased, to make him a return, which would place him above temptation from poverty. Beauchamp, who hated that anyone should feel he was conferring an obligation upon them, added many a reason to show that he was rather pleasing himself than loading them with benefits, and as he read, the young sailor shook his head with the first smile that had curled his lip for many weeks. "Ay," he said, "he is a noble gentleman as ever lived. But he need not have said so much to make us take the money, mother, for if there is anybody in the world I could be proud to take it from, it is from Mr. Beauchamp. And I declare, mother, if I get over it all, I will try all my life to do nothing but what is right, just to show him that I am grateful." "It is far the best way that you can show it, Wat," replied his mother. "And oh, my boy, it is the only way that you ever can set your mother's heart at peace again." "Well, I will, mother, I will," cried the lad, grasping her hand, "and I am sure heaven will help me if I try, for since I have had this wound through my side, I have not felt half so wild and wilful as I used to do. And when I was in the prison of a night, I tried to pray many a time, and if it had not been for that, I don't think I should have got through the whole of that bad business steadily. So I will try and do right, indeed I will." The tears streamed down his mother's cheeks, for the relief that Beauchamp's liberality had given her was nothing to that which those words afforded, and the night passed over in peace. The next morning the news spread through Emberton that the widow's son had returned, and one or two of the ladies of that place, suddenly smitten with an interest in the widow's fate, called at the cottage that they had never entered before, just to ask after her and her son. They carried no gossip back into the town with them, however, for the widow coldly, though civilly, replied that her son was not well, and dismissed them with a brief answer to more impertinent questions. 3 days after that again, the fresh tidings fluttered on the air of Emberton that widow Harrison and her son had left the place and had gone to France. Everyone opened their eyes, everyone conjectured, and then the 9 days' wonder was over, and the whole affair was forgotten. Only one person in the neighbourhood saw the young sailor after his return. This was Dr. Wilton, who, having delivered in person the packet which Beauchamp had sent to the widow, was now visited by both herself and her son ere their departure, with a request that he would convey to their benefactor the expression of their deepest gratitude. The worthy clergyman, on first hearing who it was that awaited him in his library, had meditated an exhortation to the young sailor on his future conduct, but when he saw the worn and haggard look, and the evident traces of ruined health which his countenance displayed, all that was severe in the good man's oration died away, and it breathed nothing but hope and consolation. "You say you are going to France," he added, "and I will give you 2 books to take with you, which, after your Bible, I should wish you to read attentively. They contain neither cant nor affectation," he added, "but they point out the best way for one who has been led astray to return unto right." Both mother and son received the books with gratitude, and after having promised to let him know where they settled in France, they left the worthy clergyman in the act of muttering to himself, "He'll not live 3 months, poor unhappy lad. There is consumption in his eyes and on his cheek." Scarcely were they gone, and scarcely was Dr. Wilton's comment on the young sailor's appearance pronounced, when the rush of wheels was heard before his windows, and in a moment the servant announced Lord Ashborough. The doctor started up, bewildered, but as Beauchamp entered the room, dressed in deep mourning, the events that had lately taken place recurred to his old preceptor's mind, and shaking him by the hand, he exclaimed, "Welcome, my dear Harry, and let me pay my tribute to your new rank, though, to tell you the truth, when the servant announced the Earl of Ashborough, I scarcely knew who to expect. I had forgotten all about it, and have been calling you Mr. Beauchamp for this half hour, with 2 pensioners of yours, widow Harrison and her son. But with me, I am afraid, you will be Harry Beauchamp to the end of your days." "Let me never be anything else, I beseech you, my dear sir," replied Beauchamp, The poor widow and her son, too, know me by no other name, for the deed was drawn up before my poor uncle's death. But I must go and see them when I visit Emberton." "You will hardly find them there," replied Dr. Wilton, "for apprehensions of the rude curiosity and brutal scorn of that most gossiping place have driven them to seek an asylum on the continent. But tell me, Harry, what is the meaning of your looking so ill and so anxious?" "In regard to my ill looks," answered Beauchamp, smiling, "you must remember, my dear sir, that, as I wrote to you, I have been seriously indisposed since we last met; and as to my anxious looks, I have certainly had many a subject both of care and anxiety pressing heavily upon my mind. The sudden death of my uncle, and all the consequent trouble, both in examining his affairs and in punishing a rascally agent, who endeavoured to throw the basest imputations upon the memory of his benefactor, have occupied more of my time and attention than was at all pleasant to me." "I hope, at least, you have succeeded in doing justice upon the agent," replied Dr. Wilton. "I have seen something of the affair in the newspapers." "I have not punished Mr. Timms quite so well as I could have wished," Beauchamp answered, "though he thinks the retribution more than severe. The fact is, I am afraid my uncle suffered him to make use of his name with too great freedom, and the lawyer has of course taken advantage of it to screen himself at his patron's expense. Nevertheless, I compelled him to refund everything that he had unjustly appropriated. But although I believe we have proof sufficient of one or two direct frauds to have had his name struck off the roll of attorneys with disgrace, and perhaps might have punished him still farther, I have been obliged to compromise that matter, and suffer him to make his retirement from business a voluntary act." A slight glow upon Henry Beauchamp's cheek showed Dr. Wilton plainly that there had been parts in the conduct of the late Earl of Ashborough which his nephew did not feel to have been quite justifiable; and therefore, turning the conversation from a topic which he saw was disagreeable in some of its details, he answered, "That the man was a rogue in grain, I have never had any doubt, since all the business relating to the murder of his unhappy uncle, and the charge he preferred against poor William Delaware. But pray, Harry, can you tell me what has become of Sir Sidney and his family? You of course know." "Indeed, my dear sir, I do not," answered Beauchamp, "and one great reason for my coming down here was to ask you the very same question that you have asked me. I have caused my solicitor in London to apply to the trustees of Captain and Miss Delaware to ascertain their present residence. He replied, however, that he was as ignorant upon the subject as anyone. The £10,000 that they inherited from their mother he had sold out, he said, at a moment's notice, and transmitted to Sir Sidney at Mrs. Darlington's, since which time he had heard nothing of their movements." "Strange enough," replied Dr. Wilton, "but we must make inquiries in the neighbourhood while you stay with me, and of course we shall find someone who knows their address, some of the farmers, or Mr. Johnston, who used to collect Sir Sidney's rents, or someone." "I'm afraid it will be a more difficult matter than you anticipate," replied Beauchamp. "I sought them in vain when I was in France, though I knew that they must have landed at Cherbourg; but I found that, as they had undoubtedly gone to join William Delaware himself, their route had been studiously concealed. Several weeks have now elapsed since the trial, and yet, though Captain Delaware's character stands as clear as ever it did, we have heard nothing of him." Dr. Wilton did not now require to be told what was the chief cause of that expression of anxiety which he had remarked in Beauchamp's countenance; but he knew that to a lover, and an ardent one, which he felt his pupil would be wherever he did love, the subject of his hopes and fears could never become painful or tiresome when once it had been spoken of, and he therefore went on boldly to ask whether Beauchamp had or had not discovered since that he was right in thinking that Blanche's conduct in rejecting his hand had proceeded from some misapprehension. "No, indeed, my dear sir," replied Beauchamp. "As I told you at the time, there could be no misapprehension in the business, nor have I discovered anything since on any subject which would lead me to think so. Indeed, I have but had the pleasure of meeting Miss Delaware once since I last saw you." Nay, nay, if you speak of her in such set and formal terms, poor girl, cried the clergyman with a gay smile, I shall think that your lordship's new dignity has changed your views in regard to such an alliance. Is it so, my noble lord? Beauchamp laughed, but faintly. No, no, he replied, my views are the same. All I can hope is, that the new dignity you speak of may change hers. And yet, he added, that would make it all worthless together. Take care, Harry, take care, cried Dr. Wilton with a warning shake of the head. Many a man has frittered away his happiness with just such sentences as that. But I will assure you that your title will make no difference in the views of Blanche Delaware, so that if you had no other recommendation than that, you may give yourself up to despair. But you young men are so impatient. Here you are fretting yourself to death, because you do not discover the residence of your lady love as soon as you think fit to seek it. Indeed, my dear sir, you are quite mistaken, answered Beauchamp. My chief desire is to see William Delaware and his father, and showing them that every difficulty which surrounded them in life is now removed, to share in the happiness that such a change must occasion them. That is all, indeed. Pooh, my dear Harry, nonsense, cried his old preceptor. I never saw a man yet who could cheat his own understanding so completely as you sometimes do. You are just as anxious to see Blanche Delaware as ever man was to see the woman he loved best in the world. But we will find her, my dear boy, we will find her. Their search, however, in the neighbourhood of Emberton proved entirely in vain. Neither agent nor farmers knew anything of the track of Sir Sidney and Miss Delaware, and at the end of a week Beauchamp's last hope was reduced to the information possessed by Mrs. Darlington. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of 30 Years Since by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 41. Maria, said the Earl of Ashborough, addressing Miss Beauchamp on the morning after his return from Emberton, what say you, dear sister, to a tour of the continent for 6 months or a year? Why, personally, I should have no objection, Henry, answered Miss Beauchamp. But you forget, my dear brother, there are 9 very respectable gentlemen, young and old, expiring for me at this present moment. Now, what would they do if I were to go abroad? Expire for somebody else, I suppose, replied Beauchamp. I cannot perceive any other event. Henry, Henry, cried his sister, you are perfectly insulting. But to tell you the truth, I think it is the best thing you can do, to travel to the south. For during the past month you have looked so like a gambler, or a member of the lower house, or some of those people that sit up all night and come home pale and thin in the morning, that I am ashamed to be seen with you. But seriously, I will go where you like, noble brother, she added, leaning her 2 hands half affectionately, half maliciously, on Beauchamp's arm, and looking up into his face. I will go where you like, and help you search for sweet Blanche Delaware with all my eyes. Beauchamp smiled, much less annoyed than his sister had expected, but gliding his arm round her waist, he held her tight, while he answered, Will you indeed, Maria? Well then, as a reward for your disinterested kindness, I trust you may find William Delaware with his sister. Maria Beauchamp turned as red as an infantry regiment, and struggling away from her brother's grasp, ran into her own room, where, strange to say, she wept like a child. But Beauchamp, by his retort, had at all events ensured that not one teasing word upon the subject of Blanche Delaware should pass his sister's lips, and as soon as he could arrange his affairs, which of course kept him 3 weeks longer than he had expected, with 2 carriages, as little baggage, and as few servants as his sister would suffer him to take, he was once more rolling away toward Dover. Following the invariable rule of looking in instead of looking out, we shall much prefer giving a sketch of what was passing in the heart of Henry Beauchamp, Earl of Ashborough, to depicting the beauties of the Canterbury Road, or expatiating on the sublimities of Rochester and Chatham. As Dr. Wilton had imagined, Beauchamp certainly was as impatient as human being could be to see Blanche Delaware and to make one more effort for happiness. But there were many points in Beauchamp's situation, and many feelings at Beauchamp's heart, which the good rector had not taken at all into account. Ever since he had parted with Blanche at the Prior's Fountain, he had been placed in the painful circumstances of a rejected lover, while just a sufficient degree of hope had been left to keep love alive, to render the feeling of disappointment perpetual, and to aggravate its bitterness by doubt. In seeking her he loved, therefore, he knew not what he was to expect, but as he was not one to be satisfied with anything less than love for love, he determined that he would not suffer his exertions in favour of William Delaware to be urged as any tie upon Miss Delaware's affection, but that he would have the clearest assurance that the heart was his before he again asked the hand, which, in his eyes, would be worthless without it. He felt, indeed, that it would be difficult to press Blanche upon the subject of her former rejection of his suit, and yet he perversely determined that the rejection ought to be explained before the suit could be renewed. These thoughts, however, and the many contending emotions with which they were connected, both agitated and depressed him, and the hopes which his short interview with Blanche at the inn, as well as several previous considerations, had excited, waxed weak and faint as he crossed the Channel and found he was approaching nearer to her dwelling. In Paris, however, he was destined to meet another disappointment, slight indeed, but calculated to increase the impatience that was glowing upon him. He found, on inquiring at Mrs. Darlington's hotel, that she had left the French metropolis 2 days before for Italy, and as the people of the house had informed him that her departure had been somewhat sudden, he immediately settled it in his own mind that she had heard some tidings of the Delawares, and had proceeded at once to join them. Now, although when Beauchamp came to reflect upon this supposition, he found that it did not very well agree with the indifferent, comfort-loving, bonnet and cap sort of character of Mrs. Darlington, yet it was a favourite fancy, and he did not choose to give it up. He therefore intimated his wish that his sister would agree to pursue their way to Italy without delay. And Miss Beauchamp, although she was really fatigued with a long journey over a road that can never have been mended since the days of Clovis, as Chateaubriand calls the French king, acquiesced at once without further hesitation. She did it so sweetly and so good-humouredly too, that it opened her brother's heart at once, and sitting down beside her, he told her all his motives, and all his wishes, and all his hopes, in a way that defied her taking advantage of him even by a smile. In return, he gained a world of good advice, which, as it came from a woman, and related to a woman, Beauchamp wisely treasured up for service. With scarcely a day's interval, the whole party were once more upon the road, but as the way or ways from Paris to Geneva are each and all as well beaten by English travellers as that between London and Dover, we shall not pause to itinerize even here. At only one small town on the road shall we take the liberty of stopping, inasmuch as an accidental circumstance induced Beauchamp to stay there longer than he had at first proposed. He had chosen the road by Dijon instead of that by Massel, and after sleeping at Dole, set out early in the morning in the hopes of reaching Geneva that night. The first stage from Dole, if we remember right, is Mont-sous-Vaudrey. At all events, if it be not the first, it is the second, and perhaps the reader and the guide-book will excuse us if we make mistake. Here, however, Beauchamp changed horses about 10:30, and then rattled on through that neat little village, entered a part of the forest of Raon, and then, after winding on up and down the wavy hills at the foot of the Jura, reached the small village of Aumont, at the distance of about 5 or 6 miles from the relay. Without stopping there, however, the postillion trotted on, and driving through the Crozane, paused for a moment to let his horses pant, while Beauchamp and his sister gazed out upon a wide and very beautiful scene of hill and valley, lighted up by the soft sunshine of spring, with an occasional wreath of morning mist hanging upon the brows of the mountains. "What town is that?" demanded Beauchamp, speaking out of the window to the postillion. "There, before you, a little to the left, leaning its back against the hills, with 2 or 3 neat chateaux scattered on the slope." "C'est Poligny, monsieur," replied the postillion, and adding that they changed horses there, rode on. As they approached the little town, the country became richly cultivated in vines and corn, and the aspect of the whole scene, backed by mountains and sparkling with 1,000 streams, was gay and engaging. "What a beautiful spot!" cried Miss Beauchamp. "I really think, Henry, when you marry, and turn me out of your house to die an old maid, I will buy yon grey château on the hill, looking something between a village church and a farmhouse, and spend the rest of my days at Poligny." "See it first on a rainy day, Maria," replied her brother, whose increasing anxiety and impatience did not afford the brightest medium through which to view the world. "Out, cynic!" cried his sister. "I will never see things on a rainy day when I can see them on a fine one. And now tell me, whither are you going to whirl me at this violent rate? What particular spot on the earth's surface is the ultimate object of this journey, my lord? Or are we to go on rolling for ever?" "Why, I think, my dear sister," replied Beauchamp, musing, "I think it is not unlikely to end in Sicily. I have some reason to imagine—" "Goodness!" exclaimed Miss Beauchamp, interrupting him. "That must surely be an Englishwoman in the widow's dress." "Aye, postillion, arrêtez, arrêtez donc," was all the young earl's reply to his sister's observation; and the next moment, much to her surprise, he was out of the carriage and speaking kindly to the woman whom she had noticed, and who had turned round to take a casual glance of the 2 gay carriages that came dashing up into the little quiet town of Poligny. "Indeed, is he so ill?" said Beauchamp gravely, as he listened to Widow Harrison's account of the journey she had lately taken, and her son's present situation. "I am really sorry to hear it, but you cannot have good medical advice here. It would be much better to get him on to Geneva." "Oh, but indeed we have very good advice, sir," answered the widow. "There is good Dr. Arnoux here, who was in England in the time before the war, an emigrant, and lodged for 3 years in our house at Emberton, before our misfortunes. I have just been getting Walter's medicines while he is asleep." "Well, Mrs. Harrison," replied Beauchamp, whose natural kindness of heart was not to be mastered even by impatience, "I will stay here at the inn to-day, and whenever you think that your son is likely to be awake, I will come down and see him. But you must point me out the house." The poor woman replied that the young sailor was generally more drowsy in the morning, and seemed much better and more lively in the evening, and with many unobtrusive but heartfelt thanks she described to Beauchamp the way to her dwelling. "Well, then, I will come down in the evening," answered Beauchamp, "and we will see whether we cannot devise some plan that may improve his health." With this promise he returned to the carriage, and while it drove on to the auberge, satisfied his sister's curiosity in regard to the poor widow. "So now, Maria," he said, "you will have the day's rest you have been sighing for so long." "Granted out of compassion to the widow," cried his sister, "but not out of pity to me, though my whole frame has been aching for the last 3 days, and my maid was very nearly expiring at Dole." Notwithstanding this complaint, Miss Beauchamp, after luncheon, showed herself quite willing to accompany her brother on an expedition in a char-à-banc of the country among the neighbouring hills, and as they descended the stairs of the auberge to enter their little vehicle, they heard another female tongue asking one of the servants in provincial English who was the owner of the 2 splendid carriages that stood before the house. The young earl smiled as he listened to his title, given with vast pomposity by his courier, remarking to his sister that if his new rank was of no great use to himself, it was at least of some service to his servants. By the time they had reached the door, however, both the inquirer and respondent had made themselves invisible, and getting into the char-à-banc without any other attendants than the driver, the earl and his sister proceeded on their expedition. Of it we will say nothing, but refer our readers to the indispensable Mrs. Mariana Stark. On their return, however, they found their dinner prepared, and after somewhat hastily concluding that meal, Beauchamp said he would leave his sister and walk down to the widow's cottage. But Miss Beauchamp, whose heart was not always as light as it seemed, declared that she would accompany him, protesting that men were worth nothing upon a charitable errand. It was a sweet, bright evening in the end of March, with the sky through which the sun was dipping down toward its rest, so rich and warm that one might have taken it for the beginning of October had it not been for the almanac, and for the tender green of the trees, and the flood of untaught melody that came pouring from every bush. The road led down to where there are 2 or 3 scattered houses of a better class, which they call les maisons bourgeois, built upon the slope of a little dell at the back of the town, between it and the rise of the mountains. In one of these, with the face looking through the valley of the Glantine to the open country beyond, was the house now occupied by the widow. It was easily found, and Beauchamp and his sister paused ere they entered, to gaze for a moment on the rich view, lying calm and purple under the evening sky, while the dark masses of hill, on the other hand, rising up from a base of mingled wood and mature, with the small chateau that Miss Beauchamp had so much admired, breaking the line of the trees, towered up in solemn majesty above the whole. The door was open, and Beauchamp, entering first, proceeded into one of the rooms, where he heard someone speaking. The widow and her son were sitting together near the window, and both rose, though the latter moved with difficulty, to receive their benefactor. "Here is my sister come to see you, Mrs. Harrison," he said as he entered. "Sit down, Walter. I am sorry to hear that the journey has made you so ill, my poor fellow." And taking a seat opposite to him, while Miss Beauchamp beckoned Mrs. Harrison out to the door, in order to leave her brother's conversation more at liberty, he gazed upon the sunk but hectic cheek of the young sailor, and the dazzling brightness of his feverish eye. "It was not the journey, sir," replied the young man with a shake of the head, mournful but not discontented. "It was not the journey." And then, looking round to see that his mother was not there, he added, "I told you, sir, it would not last long. And I thank God for it, for I have never forgiven myself, and every hour that I linger on is a reproach to my heart. So now that I know my mother will be cared for, and that I have shown my gratitude to you and to the captain, God bless him, and that I have learned to think better than I used, I don't care how soon it comes to an end. But, sir," he continued quickly, as if he had forgotten to do so before, "I ought to thank you deeply for all your kindness, and especially, I am sure, for taking the trouble to come and see me to-night, when there are so many things you must have to do and talk about." The young man's eyes gazed vacantly out upon the prospect as he spoke. "He wanders," thought Beauchamp. "I have heard physicians say that it is a sign of approaching death with consumptive people. Oh no," he added aloud, "I have but little business of any kind to do, and indeed I should have been here before, but your mother said you were sleeping." "I sleep more in the day than at night," replied the young man. "The cough keeps me awake. But I hope, Mr. Beauchamp," he continued, in the same abrupt manner, "I hope you will forgive me everything I ever did or said amiss to you. Indeed, I am very sorry for everything wrong that I have ever done through life, and hope God will forgive me." "Your offences toward me," answered Beauchamp, "if there have been any, which I do not know, are easily forgiven, and in the Almighty we are sure of a more merciful judge than man can be. Mrs. Harrison," he said, wishing to change the subject, and hearing the door behind him open, "I should wish much to see this Dr. Arnoux, whom you mentioned to me. Where does he live?" As Beauchamp spoke, he turned round slowly in his chair, in order to address the widow, but the words had scarcely passed his lips when he started up. Looking in at the door, indeed, was the figure of his sister, with the poor widow behind her. But between him and them were 2 other figures, and darting forward with all his doubts and apprehensions and restitution swallowed up in joy, Beauchamp clasped the hand of Blanche Delaware in his own, while his left was pressed almost as warmly by Captain Delaware. "Good God!" he exclaimed. "Blanche! William! Is it possible?" "Yes, yes, indeed," replied Captain Delaware. Beauchamp, our friend, our benefactor, our guardian angel, I may call you, we have met again at length." Blanche Delaware said not a word, and though her eyes sparkled with joy that would not be kept down, and her cheek glowed like crimson at the joy her eyes betrayed, she trembled like an aspen in the wind, and sinking into a seat, a few sweet happy tears rolled over her fair face. "Well," said Miss Beauchamp, advancing from the door, "I must acknowledge that this is hardly fair, that I, who drew Mrs. Harrison out of the way when I heard who was coming, in order that this merry meeting should have none of its surprise anticipated, can find no one to welcome me. Blanche Delaware, my dear cousin," she added, taking Blanche's hand and kissing her as a sister, "how have you been this many a day? We have not met since we were no higher than that stool, but I have learned to love you nevertheless. Have you quite forgotten Maria Beauchamp?" Blanche wept outright. "What then, Mr. Beauchamp? Have you not seen Sir Sidney?" asked the widow's son, almost at the same moment. "It was very kind indeed of you to come and see me first." As he spoke, a violent fit of coughing seized him, and Beauchamp, seeing that the excitement of all that was passing round was too much for him, proposed to depart at once, telling him that he would come early the next day after having seen the physician. Miss Beauchamp, holding Blanche's hand kindly in her own, led her toward the door of the cottage, while their two brothers followed, and perhaps there was never a congregation of happier faces went forth into the world than those which stood looking over fair France from the borders of Switzerland. Maria Beauchamp turned toward the town, but Blanche hesitated and looked up to her brother. William Delaware caught her glance immediately, and straightforward as ever came at once to the point. "The truth is, Beauchamp," he said, "it might be somewhat painful for us to go up to Poligny with you, for this morning we learned a circumstance from our old housekeeper, which in fact kept us from coming down to Widow Harrison's at an earlier hour, though indeed I should personally care nothing about it." "But what is it? What has happened now?" demanded Beauchamp, in the eager and apprehensive tone of one who fears that the cup of happiness just offered to his lip may be snatched away before he can drink. "What, in fortune's name, has occurred now?" "Nothing of any consequence," answered Captain Delaware. "Only we understand, and you, who know all that has passed, will comprehend our feelings on the occasion. We understand that the Earl of Ashborough is here." "He is indeed, I am sorry to say," replied Beauchamp, pointing to the deep mourning that he wore. "But let us forget, I entreat, that anyone who has ever borne the title that I now bear felt differently from myself toward the name of Delaware." Blanche looked up to heaven, and her lips moved, but her cheek glowed eloquently again as Maria Beauchamp's hand clasped somewhat tighter upon her own, and she saw a smile, half sad, half playful, shining on her fair cousin's lip. Still the whole party paused in silence, for there was so much to be said that there was nothing said at all. Each heart was full of feelings that would have taken days to pour forth, and at length William Delaware proposed the wisest thing for all parties, that they should part for that time, as night was coming on, and meet again the next morning. "You know," he said, "what delight my father will have in seeing you, Beauchamp, and indeed I feel as if we were wronging him in anticipating any part of all that we have to talk to you about. Yonder is our residence," he added, pointing to the identical château that Miss Beauchamp had fixed upon in entering the town, "and I am sure I need not say that the sooner you come the greater will be the pleasure to us." "I shall not be late," answered Beauchamp. "Depend upon it, I shall not be late." "But, Maria, you will come also," said Blanche, looking up into her cousin's face. "Oh, certainly, dear Blanche," replied Miss Beauchamp. "As your brother can tell you, I am a very early person in my habits. You may expect to see me at 6 in the morning." Captain Delaware smiled, and could have said something in reply, but as he began to divine that, whatever might be the result, he should have more than one opportunity of seeing Maria Beauchamp again, he reserved his rejoinder, and after another lingering pause they parted. "Henry, I admire your taste," said Miss Beauchamp as they walked back to the inn. "She is beautiful, sweet girl, indeed, and will do very well to make a countess of." "Hush, hush, Maria," said her brother. "Spare your raillery yet for a while. There is much to be got over before we come to such conclusions as that. The game is yet to be played, and I will give you leave to laugh if I win." "You will be a sad bungler, my dear brother, if you lose such a game as that," replied Miss Beauchamp, "for you have all the cards in your own hands. But let us arrange our plans, Harry. At whatsoever hour you please to-morrow, you take some wild beast of a horse from the inn, and ride over by yourself. I will come to breakfast at my own time in the carriage. Nay, I will have my way this time at least, for I do not choose to have any lover in the carriage with me, except it were one of my own." Beauchamp yielded, of course, for there were more cogent arguments in his own breast in favour of his sister's plans than any she thought fit to produce. He had now food enough for thought during the evening, but he did not forget to send for good Dr. Arnoux, from whom he received a confirmation of his worst apprehensions in regard to the widow's son. From that worthy man, also, he learned that it was at his suggestion that Captain Delaware and Sir Sidney, who had been an old friend of his while he was living as an émigré at Emberton, had fixed their abode at Poligny, the retired situation of which, and its immediate proximity to both Switzerland and Germany, rendered it peculiarly advantageous under the circumstances in which they were placed for the time. The conference ended. Beauchamp retired to bed, and obtained such sleep as lovers usually are supposed to gain when their fate is in suspense. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of 30 Years Since by George Payne Rainsford James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 42. A horse was easily procured, and early on the following morning Beauchamp was on his way to the chateau inhabited by Sir Sidney Delaware and his family. The house was, like most French houses of the kind, furnished with a court in the front, large iron gates, and a wide woody enclosure called a park, stretching up the side of the hill, full of straight alleys and mathematical walks. At the corner of the enclosure Beauchamp looked at his watch, and to his surprise found that it still wanted nearly half an hour of 8. "This is very foolish of me," thought he, as he rode along the park wall. "I shall find no one up, and they will all think me mad." But at that moment, as he looked over the low wall and up one of the long alleys, he caught a sight of 2 persons crossing the farther extremity of it, and he was instantly satisfied that there were other wakeful people in the world as well as himself. "It is Blanche and her brother," he thought, and riding up to the court he flung his bridle to a boy who was standing there, and without further inquiry hastened into the park. The wood was somewhat labyrinthine, but Beauchamp had observed the direction taken by the figures he had seen, and following one of the cross alleys, he soon entered that wherein he beheld them, and in which he found they were still walking slowly on, about 100 yards before him, unconscious that there was any one in the park but themselves. As Captain Delaware was speaking eagerly and loud, Beauchamp, to avoid overhearing his conversation with his sister, hastened forward, pronouncing his name, and was almost immediately by their side. He was greeted by both with evident pleasure, but upon Blanche's cheek, though it was much paler than it had been in England, there was still that flickering blush on which we have already written a long discussion. After their first meeting was over, and Beauchamp had explained that his sister would be there in about an hour, of course all 3, as they took a step or 2 slowly forward, felt themselves rather awkward. But William Delaware was fond of cutting Gordian knots, and the next moment, after a silent smile, as he glanced first at his cousin and then at Blanche, he abruptly let her arm slip from his own, and looking gaily into Beauchamp's face, he said, "Here, Henry, give Blanche your arm, while I go to tell my father that you are here." His sister looked at him almost reproachfully, and proposed that they should all return, but Captain Delaware stayed not to listen, and the next moment she stood alone with Henry Beauchamp, with her trembling hand laid upon her lover's arm. Heaven knows what they said, for I am sure I do not. But doubtless it was something very extraordinary, for ere they had taken 2 steps forward, Beauchamp woke and detected Blanche Delaware calling him my lord. "My lord," he repeated, "my lord, is such the cold title by which I am alone to be called?" "Oh, Blanche!" Blanche found that she had got into a scrape, and as there was but one way of getting out of it in all the world, she took it at once. She paused, and though she was ready to sink where she stood, she raised her long eyelashes and fixed her beautiful eyes upon her cousin's face for one single moment, with a glance that was worth all the oriental love letters that ever were composed, imploring, tender, full of gentleness and affection. It seemed to say, do not overpower me. I am yours, heart and soul and mind, but my heart is so full, another word will break it. Beauchamp read it all at once, and pressing his hand in both of his, he asked the very intelligible question, Is it mine, dear Blanche?" "If you still wish it, Henry," she replied. "Can I refuse anything to the saviour of my brother's character, and the generous benefactor of our whole family?" The spirit of perversity seized upon Beauchamp again in a moment, and he was not satisfied. "Nay, Blanche, nay," he said, "I must win a dearer assurance than that. I will not owe to gratitude, little as I have deserved it, what I would fain to owe to love. No, I must have a dearer assurance, or I shall think that the same Blanche Delaware who accepts Henry Beauchamp in France would again refuse Henry Burrell if, unbacked by some pitiful service, he again stood by the Prior's fountain." Beauchamp's exacting mood gave Blanche the advantage, and by amusing her fancy even for a single instant, got the better of a part of her agitation. She smiled, and was half inclined to triumph, for she felt that she could if she liked. But love was the more powerful motive, and she only misused her advantage by that one playful smile, and a few words like it. "I no more refused him then," she replied, "because he was Henry Burrell, than I now accept him because he is Earl of Ashborough. Do you believe me, Henry?" she asked after a pause. "I do indeed, dear Blanche," replied Beauchamp, "but you are smiling at me still, and indeed, if you could tell me all the agony and long days of misery which that rejection caused me, I am sure you would pity the feelings that your words produced." "I did from the first, Henry, I did from the first," replied Blanche earnestly. "But you must believe me, Henry, when I tell you that I suffered double what you did. Yes, she added, seeing him shake his head. Yes, I did, for I was crushing my own heart at the very time I was obliged to crush that of him. Oh, Henry, do you not know what I felt?" "Obliged!" cried Beauchamp, catching at the word. "Obliged! Did Sir Sidney then object?" "Oh, no," answered Blanche, "nor would have objected. But it shall all be explained, Henry, if you can forgive me and love me still, notwithstanding all the pain I have made you suffer." "I have loved you ever, Blanche, with the most unabated affection," replied Beauchamp. "Nay, more, what between affection and what between vanity, I had fancied that there must be some latent cause for conduct that seemed inexplicable. I had endeavoured for some time so to frame my every word and action toward you that you could not mistake them, and it was only because you permitted those attentions, because they did not seem to displease you," Blanche blushed deeply, "because, in short, you did not repel them, that I dared to hope. I could not believe that such a heart and such a mind as that of Blanche Delaware would suffer me to go on so long unchecked, if she felt that the affection she must have seen could not be returned." Indeed, I would not," replied Blanche. "I do not pretend not to have seen what were your feelings toward me, and it is no use now of concealing what were my own." And for a moment her eyes again sought the ground. "The fact was, however," she added, smiling, "that what happened afterward was not because you were Mr. Burrell, but because I discovered you were Mr. Beauchamp." "And was that name, then, so hateful to you?" asked her lover. No, answered Blanche, "but I see I may as well tell you at once, for you will not cease to question me till I do. Do you remember the last day you ever came up to the park? Well, just after your arrival, the post came in, and among other things were 2 letters to me, one from Mrs. Darlington, and another which made me run to my own room as soon as I had opened it. It was from your uncle, the late Lord Ashborough. I scarcely like to think of it even now. It told me who you really were, and in terms, oh, so bitter, hinted that I must know it already and must be using that knowledge for evil purposes. It then went on to state that however determined you might be in the foolish line of conduct you were pursuing, your relations would never forgive our union, and that if it took place, he, Lord Ashborough, would not only disown you as his relation, but would leave every acre of land which he could alienate to the most distant relation he had, sooner than to you. The whole was wound up with the same denunciation against you, in case I ever revealed to you the fact of my having received that letter, and it ended with telling me that now, knowing these facts, I might still strive to force myself into your family if I would. But I will show you the letter, Henry, and you shall judge for yourself whether I could do otherwise. He might indeed have alienated a large part of his property, replied Beauchamp, but there was still more than enough left. And did you think, Blanche, from what you knew of me even then, that I would not have preferred a cottage with you to 10 times the amount he could have taken away without you? Henry Beauchamp to a cottage, said Blanche, smiling. I am afraid that would have suited Blanche Delaware better. But remember, Henry, that I knew not what he could take from you, and even if I had known, should I have had any right to accept, to permit such a sacrifice? Oh, no, and if it had broken my heart, I must have acted as I did act. But now, Henry, let us return home. We have walked on long, and papa will certainly think it strange that I have been thus left alone with you at all. He shall soon have a good reason, dear Blanche, replied her lover, and I trust that we shall never, never part again. Beauchamp found Sir Sidney Delaware more shaken up by all he had undergone than he had anticipated, but the baronet's delight at seeing his young cousin, he declared, took 20 years from the load of age. Your father, my dear Harry, he said, was my school and college companion, and the constant friend of my heart. I thought, when I first saw you at Emberton, that your face and voice and manner were all as familiar to me as household words. But why, Harry, why did you not tell me your real name, especially when you came plotting such a service as you afterward rendered me? Because, my dear sir, replied Beauchamp, when I wrote to you a few years before, you showed no disposition to receive me in my real character. That was because you refused my first invitation just after your father's death, answered Sir Sidney. I never received it, replied the Earl. I never received it upon my honour, but I am afraid, my dear sir, that there has been more than one juggle in the business, which we had better, perhaps, consign to oblivion altogether. And now let me take advantage of your daughter's absence to make one request. You know me, Sir Sidney, my principles, my mind, my heart, and my situation. Can you trust Blanche's happiness to my care? Will you give me her hand? Sir Sidney Delaware started up. I have been blind to the last, he cried. I have been blind to the last. But think, Henry, remember what you are about. Take back your request, and ere you make it again, call to mind your rank and prospects, and judge whether interest or ambition or the world's smile may never hereafter induce you to regret that you have married a portionless girl because she had a fair face and a gentle heart. Never, Sir Sidney, replied the Earl. It requires no thought. Interest and ambition and the world's smile have never had any effect on me yet, and never shall have while my faculties remain. Well, well, replied Sir Sidney, I have not forgot that you do not worship any man for the money in his purse, nor bow low to the bottle of Lafitte upon his sideboard. So, if your mind be really made up, you must ask Blanche herself. But by William's smiling, I fancy you have settled that matter between you already. If so, God's blessing and mine upon you both, and you shall have my consent upon one sole condition, which is, that you will explain to me, clearly and distinctly, all the particulars of this business from beginning to end, for I confess I sometimes begin to think that my intellect is impaired, because I cannot get it clearly stated in my own head. But stay, here are a number of questions which I have written down in pencil on the broad margin of my Seneca, intending to ask William. Will you undergo the catechism instead? Willingly, answered Beauchamp, and as I see Maria's carriage coming slowly up the hill from the town, we shall have just time, I dare say, to get through your questions before she breaks in upon us with her gay pertness. She shall be most welcome, said Sir Sidney, and then, with spectacles on nose and book in hand, he proceeded to read the interrogatories with which he had charged the margin of his Seneca, and thus Beauchamp was called upon to explain a great deal that the worthy reader, who has walked hand in hand along with him through the book, already understands full well. And now then, tell me, continued Sir Sidney, after he had dispatched a great number of his questions, how did you contrive to place the money so cleverly in William's room at Emberton, without anyone seeing you? The fact is, my dear sir, answered Beauchamp, that I knew the house and all its passages as well as, if not better than any of you. You must remember that a great part of my boyhood was spent there, and 1,000 times, under my incognito name of Burrell, I had nearly betrayed my acquaintance with every room in the building. I had seen, in walking round the house, that the door of the well vault, as it used to be called, was always open, and when I wanted to place the money in your son's room without being seen, I resolved to try the little staircase up and down which I had often played at hide-and-seek. I thus made my way to the trap-door, when to my surprise and mortification I found it nailed. As, however, it shook under my hand when I tried it, I resolved to make a strong effort to push it open, in which I succeeded, the nail either breaking or coming out. I did not stay to examine which. My hand, however, was torn in doing so, and unfortunately a drop of blood fell upon one of the notes, as I folded them up in a sheet of paper I found on the table. The packet I directed as well as I could by the moonlight, and I then put down the money and went away as fast as I could. That just brings me to my last question, said Sir Sidney, and here is your sister driving into the court, so tell me why it was you did not rather give the money into my hands, or William's, or Blanche's, or anyone's, rather than risking it in such a situation. Beauchamp laughed, and turning toward Miss Delaware, who was just then re-entering the room, he replied, Really, Sir Sidney, I must refuse to plead. You must ask Blanche. Well then, you tell me, my love, continued the baronet, turning to his daughter, what could your cousin's reason be for putting the money that has caused us so much anxiety into William's room that night, rather than giving it to me or you, as it seems he knew that William was out? Beauchamp and Captain Delaware both smiled, and Blanche blushed deeply, but was silent. So, said Sir Sidney, is it so? Well, well, I stop my questions there. William, run out and welcome your fair cousin. Blanche, give me your hand. There, Henry, take her, and may she ever be to you as dear, as gentle, as good, and as beloved a wife as her mother was to me. There was but little more now to be explained, though Sir Sidney, in reward for the young earl's patience under cross-examination, took great pains to make him understand how his son William had found means, through their poor pensioner, widow Harrison herself, to communicate to the family his safe arrival in France, and a plan for their meeting, which had been immediately adopted. How they had skilfully contrived to conceal their route, and how their good old friend Arnoux had prevailed upon them to pause at Poligny instead of going on to Sicily as they had at first intended. From widow Harrison, too, to whose faith and gratitude they could trust, and to whom alone their place of residence had been communicated, they had learned by letter many of Beauchamp's efforts in their favour, as well as their success in the ultimate result of the trial. But still, although they had heard so much, there was yet matter enough to be told on both sides to furnish forth many a story for the bright fireside. Nothing more remains for the writer, to whom their own lips kindly furnish the materials for composing this book, than to add that a very few months afterward In the chapel of the British ambassador at Paris, Henry, Earl of Ashborough, was married to Blanche, only daughter of Sir Sidney Delaware, and that the body of poor Walter Harrison sleeps by the side of the Lake of Geneva. Nevertheless, it behoves us to record one serious dispute which took place between the young Earl of Ashborough and Sir Sidney Delaware, which was occasioned by the baronet insisting that his noble son-in-law should take a mortgage upon the Emberton estate for the amount of the £25,000 advanced by him to pay off the former annuity. On the other hand, however, it appeared that the late Earl had been, at the moment of his death, in the prosecution of a suit to prove that the annuity had not been legally paid off. It was true also that Beauchamp had received the £25,000 back again from Mr. Timms, and that the annuity had been paid up to the very last day of the late Earl's life. Beauchamp therefore contended that he had no right whatever to demand or accept any mortgage, as the money had returned to his own possession, and the annuity must be considered to have lapsed with the life of his uncle. Sir Sidney would not see it in this point of view, and a great deal of good-humoured special pleading went on upon the subject between him and the Earl. How it all would have ended, heaven only knows, had not Maria Beauchamp, who had got safely over the critical epoch of her brother's marriage, and even held out for 4 months after, while he brought his fair bride to England, and made her look into an English court for 1 moment, which was quite enough for both of them, had she not, I say, at the end of the time, broken the hearts of her 9 London admirers, young and old, by giving her hand to William Delaware. She protested, indeed, that she only did it for convenience, as her brother and Blanche, with Sir Sidney, his son, and herself, were about to take a long rambling tour over 1/4 of the world, and she could not, of course, go so many thousand miles with a young single man, without giving employment to the tongues of her acquaintances. However that might be, to end the dispute about the £25,000, the Earl insisted upon adding it to his sister's fortune, which was already sufficient to clear off every encumbrance, and leave the family of Delaware more prosperous than it had been for nearly a century before. We could go on a long time, and write another volume upon Blanche's happy looks, and tell how Beauchamp, contented in his love, weaned himself from many of his perversities and caprices, without losing the brighter and the nobler qualities of his character. Nor would adventures be wanting, nor the same light and idle nothings of which this book is already principally composed. But unfortunately, having called the work The Ruined Family, we find ourselves bound to close it here, now that we can no longer apply that term to the house of Delaware. End of chapter 42. End of 30 Years Since, or The Ruined Family, by George Payne Rainsford James. Read by Lynne Thompson. Tucson, Arizona, 2025.